Do you find it queer that I avoid lakes and rivers and seafood aisles? That I refuse all boats or ferries or even bridges that span over water? Do you find it humorous that even at the mere mention of the word fish, my hands start to tremble and my eyes go wide with horror? Do not laugh. Do not laugh, for if you would have seen what I had seen, you would act the same. They say not to trust the word of a dishonest man, and I will not pretend that I have lived my life morally or that the advice is foul. I have been a thief, a liar, and, although never directly by my own actions, a killer. My hands are not clean of sin, and my word carries little trust with those that know me. But I have no reason to lie about my crippling fear of those strange-eyed, limbless creatures that hold dominion over the dark corners of the sea. I have no reason to lie about the terrible old Estonian who haunts my dreams each and every night. I was first made aware of the feeble fisherman by an old colleague of mine, Tiao Candido. Candido had been vacationing in Britain with one of his lovers when he became aware of the potential business opportunity. The grey English skies and a company of warm young flesh did nothing to deter Candido's keen eye. When the Brazilian noticed the old crippled man paying at the grocer's with golden coins of centuries past, all promise of a romantic seaside getaway was obliterated and replaced with cold calculations. For 2 days, Candido surveilled the potential target and his domicile. Once the Brazilian mapped out the manner in which the old man lived and developed an account of how he spent his days, Candido bid goodbye to his companion and gave us a call. There was a job waiting for us in a sleepy British seaside town, he said. The job was simple and the pay was good, he said. If we didn't interview the old fisherman soon enough, someone else would do so in our stead, he said. I have never been work-shy, and I was not work-shy then. The night Candido contacted me about the job, I booked my flight, and by sunset the following day, I had taken up residence in the bed and breakfast where the Brazilian was staying. When Candido took me to observe the old fisherman, I found his assessment of the job to be flawless. The mark was, indeed, feeble beyond being a threat, and his life was solitary enough to invite the likes of Tiao Candido and me into his home. The fisherman was completely bald and had the skin of an old abandoned leather couch. His voluminous round body moved like a moon robbed of orbits, and was always covered in an aged yellow raincoat, which gave the old fisherman the appearance of one of those round toys that can never be knocked over. We watched the old man in his waking hours, and when he slept, we drank in a nearby pub. Candido, with his tendency to seduce all that walked on 2 feet, has always been the more charming. Without ever directly mentioning the old man, my Brazilian associate prodded the bartender for information about the strange foreigner which lived on the edge of the quaint town. Even before we were halfway through with our pints, the bartender provided to be a well of information. The old fisherman, he said, was quite the talk of the town. Many years prior, he had bought the seaside manor which had been long abandoned by its original owners. At first, the townfolk celebrated the purchase, hoping perhaps that the broken regal home would be refurbished to its former glory and thus lure tourists back into the region. When the old man eschewed all repairs and simply moved into the broken home as it was, the townsfolk speculated over what would urge a man to live without plumbing or electricity. When the old man took to paying for his groceries with ancient golden coins that fetched exuberant prices in the cyberspace, the town grew even more bewildered. The youths of the town, the bartender said, had taken to teasing the old fisherman over sluggishness and strangeness. Every night, for weeks on end, they would sneak past the iron gates of the manor and watch him through the grated windows which led to the basement of the broken-down house. The strange fisherman, they claimed, had a collection of jars which preserved the remnants of odd fish and various other unidentifiable beasts of the sea. Each night, in a Baltic tongue that none of the locals could understand, the old fisherman would sing melancholic songs to his collection of specimens. The youth of the town, the bartender said, found his queer expressions of affection for the dead creatures to be the pinnacle of comedy. Every night, for weeks on end, the youths would sneak into the old fisherman's property and jeer and laugh at him from behind a window. Once the vulgarity of the children became unavoidable, their parents begged them to stop, but the youths refused to listen. It isn't until one of the youths disappeared that the torment stopped. For 5 days, the child was missing. The boy was perhaps the most vulgar of the bunch and would often throw rocks at the aged fisherman whenever he passed him on the street. Naturally, the old man was seen as a suspect of the boy's disappearance. When the boy disappeared, his friends were quick to point the finger at the strange foreigner living in a decrepit manor. Nothing came of their accusations, however, even after the old man's home was searched. One of the police, who was returning from the manor, sat down for a pint at this very bar, the bartender claimed. He spoke of horrid living conditions and an inescapable stench of rot and cigarettes. Cigarette butts so old that they looked like baby teeth were scattered all across the manor, and the structure itself looked as if it was to fall apart at any moment. The queerest specimens of sea life were found in jars that the old man's basement held. The most hideous of rots was found in the walls. No trace of the lost boy presented itself, though. Eventually, the old foreigner's name was cleared by the authorities, and he was free to return to his queer ways. It was the night after the old man's search, the bartender said, that the missing child was finally found. He washed up on the shoreline to the horror of the morning joggers. The boy had been long dead, marred in seaweed and crustaceans which he surely picked up along his journey. The coroners ruled the death of drowning, and, as tragic as the fact was, the town moved on. Candido was a most rapturous audience to the bartender's story, and when the tale concluded, he prodded the man with questions. Was there any speculation of how the old foreigner managed to afford such a manor? Surely one cannot gain such wealth as a humble fisherman. Did the police say anything else of the old man's lodging, and of the golden and silver coins which the fisherman was said to use for his groceries? Was there any truth to that? The bartender was most cheerful at the start of his talk with Candido, yet the Brazilian's rapid questions stole away his smile. For a discomforting amount of time, the man behind the bar looked at Candido, probing him with his eyes. Then, quietly, he asked my Brazilian colleague if he was an officer of the law. Candido laughed. So did I. Eventually, so did the bartender. The policeman stayed for more than a pint. The more he drank, the more he spoke, and finally, with his last drink, he told the bartender of the chests that the search party had found. They were found hidden behind old moth-ridden curtains down in the basement, and the old fisherman protested in the little English he knew against opening them. When the lawmen started to suspect that he had hidden the missing child in one of these chests, however, the old fisherman capitulated and opened the chest with a heavy brass key he kept nearby. Gold and silver, ancient coins, thousands, if not tens of thousands, of ancient prized metals. Yes, it was true. The old fisherman paid with the money of dead empires at the store. This everyone in town knew. What they did not know, what only the bartender and the policeman knew, was how much gold and silver the old man truly had. The drunk policeman, upon leaving, paid for his bill in such coins and left a generous tip. Without any prodding, the bartender proudly revealed the booty which the man of law stole from the fisherman. They were adorned with centuries-old insignia which neither Candido nor me had any knowledge of. I thought a picture of the coins would suffice for research, yet by the end of the night, Candido had the bartender singing songs in Portuguese and proclaiming the beginning of a lifelong friendship. As a gift, the bartender handed us each a coin when we finally left the pub. Once we returned back to our lodgings, we contacted Hans Stiegelbauer, an Austrian locksmith who we both have worked with on multiple occasions. Stiegelbauer left much to be desired in the realm of social graces, yet he was quick as a key when confronted with a lock and, more importantly, a skilled historian. When the Austrian arrived in a seaside town 2 days later, he confirmed that the coins were indeed of a fine heritage. The silver currency was that of the 15th century Hansa traders, and the gold looked as if it might trace its lineage back to the Vikings. From the town's grocer, while claiming to be the secretary of a famous coin appraiser, Candido received an additional sample of coins. That currency, as varied as it was, also traced its lineage back to days of old. It would fetch a handsome price at the market, Stiegelbauer appraised. Reappropriating the collection from whence the currency came was deemed a worthy use of our time. The plan we constructed to obtain more of the old fisherman's wealth was simple. I would park the van near his manor in the morning as to not arouse suspicion, and then move it closer when the heist was at hand. After sundown, Candido and Stiegelbauer would enter the manor. Candido would go off to interview the old man, while Stiegelbauer would descend down into the basement to assess the situation with the trunks and coins. With the old fisherman restrained, my colleagues would take the chest and whatever other valuables they could find and load them in the van. It was a simple plan, yet simply it did not go. Stiegelbauer, as I mentioned, is the foulest of characters, and has a dark soul even for someone in a thief's profession. It is him who I blamed on the slow progress of the heist. I was unsure whether the Austrian locksmith had distracted himself with the old fisherman's private possessions, or whether one of his more violent moods was to blame, yet the result was the same. Well over an hour was I left waiting in the van outside of the manor. As the handle on my watch dragged on, my anxiety grew. Yet there was a moment, perhaps 2 hours after my associates had entered the manor, when my panic reached to wholly unmanageable heights. I was worried about the progress of the heist, and that worry was present, yet the shot of panic that hit me was entirely different from the thoughts of a reasonable man. The move above me was luminous and full, yet there was no stars in the sky. Suddenly, with no warning and no reason, my eyes perceived the moon above not as a celestial body but as a fisheye. I could not describe it, and I dare not dwell into those fetid corners of my psyche again. Yet I was sure that the moon had turned into a primordial eyeball which stared down at me with expressionless animalistic interest. I was submerged into sweat and terrified awe. I sat in that van, scarcely trusting my eyes or mind, staring at the suddenly organic moon above. That is when the doors to the manor burst open and I saw a shadowy silhouette of 2 men carrying a trunk. Or at least, what I thought were 2 men carrying a trunk. With work at hand, I managed to push away the thoughts of the living celestial body away and replace my thoughts with frustration at my colleagues for moving too slow. My frustration did not last long, however, for what emerged out of the shadows was not Candido or Stiegelbauer. What emerged from the shadows was not a man at all. He did not wear his filthy raincoat, and it made all the difference. The old fisherman's head was still human, yet it is the only part of him which was reminiscent of civilized life. His neck connected to a chest so frail that it barely hinted at human origin, yet it were his limbs which wholly defied the biology of man. The creature that stumbled out of the decrepit manor stood on a dozen strands of writhing fat purple flesh which seemed to have a mind of their own. As the old fisherman moved, his tentacled mass snipped and whipped at the world about. It was the fish which truly drove my fear past the limits of sanity. His arms were fish. 2 foreign forms of life, which only hold the slightest resemblance to the animal man knows as carp. Their mouths open and closed, and the massive gills by their eyes swelled with effort. The old man slid towards me in a sudden burst of speed, with his monstrous hands outstretched as if looking to embrace me. As he moved, as the terrible limbs of sea beasts approached, I spied the fish had teeth. Long sharp rows of teeth which twisted and turned and snapped with each move of the lips. As he approached, the old Estonian yelled a sort of song at me in his foreign tongue. I did not listen for long, and I dared not try to recall the song in fear of my health. Before I even acknowledged the new world of madness I had been plunged into, I found myself driving as fast as I could through the British countryside. Eventually, in fear of being questioned by the law, I eased my foot off the pedal. Yet I did not stop driving until the sun was peeking over the horizon and no large bodies of water were in sight. Exhausted, I parked my car at the rest stop and hoped I would awaken elsewhere, finding the whole affair a dream. I did not. I awoke in the rented van, my body drenched in sweat sowed from terrible dreams of the sea. My back had received my resting place poorly, and even though I woke well into the afternoon, my body was beyond exhausted. I made no attempt to contact Candido or Stiegelbauer, for I saw no hope of evading the beast that lives in the manor on foot. Until now, I know not their fate. Perhaps one might browse the newspaper archives of a certain seaside town, yet I do not have the mental fortitude for such walks down memory lane. It is not because I lost my colleagues that I despise the presence of those gill-breathing monstrosities that hide in the deepest depths of the ocean. No. In this industry, one learns not to get too attached to one's associates. The true source of my fear, of my absolute hatred for all that is associated with life and water, did not come until later that evening. It was while I was checking into my hotel that the true nature of my fear manifested. It was a quaint provincial hotel which on its walls held commemorations for history even the locals wouldn't find interesting. While the check-in girl worked at the details of my sleeping quarters, I noticed that the hotel had an aquarium in the lobby. That is when the nature of my curse started to make itself painfully clear. The fish, both big and small, colorful and plain, they were all staring at me. They stared at me with the same primitive eyes that the moon above stared on with, that the terrible appendages of the monstrous fisherman stared on with. The fish watched me, as if they knew of my terrible night at the broken down manor. In that moment, I buried all discomfort beneath the lie that I had simply not gotten enough sleep. The attention of the pet fish in the lobby of the hotel was no fluke, however. On my return home, there was a large aquarium in the airport, and I was once again the center of the animals' attention. They know. Somehow, through an interconnected mind which man cannot comprehend, they know. The fish know that I meant their old master ill, and even though man jokes about those slimy beasts of gills having short memories, I feel like the humor is deeply misplaced. Do not laugh. The fish know what I did. Everywhere I go, the fish know what I did. They know what I did, and a righteous, confident fear burns in my chest that one day they will take revenge on me for my sinful ways. Until recently, all who knew me thought me dead. They thought me a sunken corpse, trapped in a mammoth metal tomb at the bottom of the sea. They counted me among the scores of charred corpses that have, and forever will, wash upon the shore of foreign lands bearing our tainted insignia. They thought my person rendered unrecognizable and inhuman by the shells of the enemy. They could not find my body, but they thought me dead. It is, after all, on the battlefield that a corpse is best lost in a crowd. My father gripped the microphone with shaking hands and shed public tears for his least favorite son. My brothers, the same ones that tanned my hide so thoroughly in my youth, have collected dizzying sums in my name and swore vengeance against the enemy that they purported had dispatched me from the earth. My family mourned my death to great publicity, and I've skewed my character to fit their needs. When I appeared haggard and broken and mad at the doorstep of our ancestral home, they did not recognize me. When I proved, without a shred of doubt, that I am of their blood, they refused to recognize me. It wasn't until I was dragged away by the authorities and forced for 3 days and nights into a windowless cell that my existence became an irrefutable legal fact. I was hosed and shaved and dressed in a uniform which amplified my delirium to heights requiring tranquilizers. When my family met me again, they greeted me with tears of joy to the presence of all the local propagandists. I was given handshakes and hugs and commendations and medals, yet when I was handed a microphone and asked to speak on the subject of my survival, the sound was cut short. I tried to express the horrors that I have seen at sea, to warn others who might follow in my tracks. Yet the state has no interest in the truth. It never did. My family thought me dead, and they were not completely wrong. When I was out there, stuck in that incomprehensible plane of dark blue, I lost a part of myself. A part of my soul was left behind in those frigid wastes of water, and I am left as nothing but a mad, shambling corpse. I may walk, I may breathe, and my wounds have fully healed, but they thought me dead, and they were not completely wrong. I write these words of my own accord. I write them as a testament to the horrors I have witnessed. I write them as a means of preserving the little sanity I have left and the little time I have left. For when the sun rises and another day begins anew and they knock on my door, I shall dispatch myself with the letter opener that sits ready for me on the desk. Such gravity is the horrors of my past. So maddening is the anguish of my present. It is with the same ornate blade that I unsealed my military summons many months prior. Life had not been swell back then, and I had always thought of myself as a most persecuted character, yet that envelope I found sitting on my study wholly consumed my heart in a fit of tragedy. I sunk down into my chair and did not move from the spot until I had emptied half my cigarette case. Eventually, I finally gathered the courage to bring the letter to my father in hopes that he would help me avoid its consequences. He was, after all, a man of great provincial power, and he did, just a few short years prior, help me avoid conscription with no fuss or argument. He even helped secure papers that I was trained in an administrative branch to ensure I would be kept away from the fighting if unfortunate circumstances were to occur. I walked into his study in high hopes that he would label the summons a political provocation, or that he would perhaps call the local recruitment office on my behalf and threaten retribution for their summoning of his son. But he did no such thing. Instead, he produced his spectacles, read through the document with great diligence, and then, with a long sigh, as if he'd suffered a grave but manageable inconvenience, he said, "Maybe they'll make a man of you yet." Throughout my life, I have long suffered bouts of vertigo and panic, yet my body had never failed me before. No matter how anxious and overwhelmed my mind would get, my consciousness never departed. It wasn't until I was left rubber-kneed and speechless in my father's study that I suffered true betrayal from within. One moment, I was trying to stoke embers of empathy in the patriarch's loveless eyes, and the next, I was lying in a dark room with a cold compress on my face. I had fainted, my mother informed me, sitting on the side of my bed. My father had not been pleased with my hysterics, and in my mother's eyes, I had indeed overreacted. She had read the summons herself while I was indisposed, and found that I wasn't being summoned to serve in the military. I was only asked to stop by the recruitment office for a health checkup. Surely, my mother thought, once the military men saw my frail build, they would deem me unworthy of the army, and I could return back home. I knew her words, as always, were tainted with wine and naive optimism, but let those blind dreams of escape accompany me into a shallow, dreamless sleep. When I arrived at the enlistment office the following day, whatever illusions I had about avoiding military service were quickly dispelled. I was to go to war, but I took some amount of comfort that, according to my conscription papers, I was only suited for administrative work. That illusion too, however, was quickly brought to dissipate. We were loaded onto a bus that would have been considered a relic in my childhood. A few of the men sang patriotic songs to pass the time. Some drank and played cards in the back. Most, as I stared out of the window in defeated silence. When we arrived at our new, less than favorable lodgings, I tried arguing my case with the superiors. They were deaf to my pleas. I was to go where I was told to go and put up no debate. My insistence at being put on administrative duties did nothing to sway those of higher rank, but they did serve as a source of great entertainment to the fellow mobilized. For 3 days we stayed in improvised cots in an abandoned warehouse. There was no heating, the food was barely fit for dogs, and the commanding officers treated us as belligerent children. My fellow soldiers, much like my brothers and cousins in the days of my youth, quickly discovered my powerless nature and took advantage of it. I was robbed, I was beaten, and on the third night in the foul-smelling warehouse, I woke to abhorrent threats to my bodily autonomy. I believe these threats were never brought into fruition, but I am not certain, for when I woke from my troubled slumber and found the laughing brutes gathered around my cot, my soul routed from my body and drove my mind into another fainting fit. When, the following morning, I was urged on to another bus, I had hoped a change in my environs would bring my suffering to an end. It did not. After a drive which took us hungrily through the night, we were brought to a port, and from that port ushered into a battleship, referred to as the Victorious. I urged the commanding officer to check my documents. I invoked my father's name so many times that the name lost all meaning and broke down into nothing but a collection of syllables. I argued and struggled against being brought onto the ship, yet my protests earned me nothing but violence. Soon, with tears in my eyes and numbness in my knees, I watched the recognizable shore give way to an unending plain of dark blue. Standing there, gripping the railing, I was sure that I would meet my end at sea and never stand upon land again. Undoubtedly, things would have been better that way. I would be happier dead and ignorant of the inconceivable wickedness that hides in the uncharted depths of the sea. How long I spent aboard the Victorious I do not know. Prior to setting foot on the battleship, I had never been at sea, and my stomach deeply disagreed with the constant swaying of my new environs. The men with which I shared the ship proved to be just as brutal as I had come to expect of the military, and the food which was served made me pine for the gruel I had consumed at land. Along with the sickness and cruelty I experienced aboard the Victorious, there was also the terror of the enemy to contend with. Each day, from the sky, unmanned machines bearing munitions descended upon us. They were dispatched by our defenses, yet the strikes were not always instant, and the mess hall carried many stories of weapon systems too sluggish to defend the crew if the assaults were to worsen. The environs of fear and sickness and abuse forced my mind further and further from my body. I disassociated. At times I felt like an outside observer watching my life play out minute by minute. At times, I felt as if I had ceased to exist altogether. I had convinced myself that this was madness. I was sure that this was what it felt like to lose one's grip on sanity. My time on the Victorious, however, would pale to the mental anguish lying in wait for me in the open seas. It happened during the night, and it happened quickly. One moment I was standing by the railing, watching the dark waters below, and the next, the world was consumed in a blaze of an inferno. The explosion had both robbed me of my hearing and balance. Before I could even register the shock of the blast, my lungs were full of ice-cold seawater. Just as I managed to recover some semblance of awareness and control my limbs, a second explosion rocked the night sky. Something had dislodged itself from the ship, for I was driven deep underwater by a force from above. It was here, once more, that I was sure my life would come to an end. I struggled to comprehend how I managed to propel my body out of that freezing baptism of death, but I did. Driven by sheer instincts and a will for survival I thought I had shed long ago, I pulled myself back to the surface. Whilst I was submerged, one of the lifeboats of the Victorious was blown off or released. I did not ponder about how my means of survival were made available. Driven by sheer instinct and adrenaline, I swam to the lifeboat and pulled myself aboard. The climb strained my body greatly, and the silent flickering madness on the deck above drained what little attention my frenzied mind was capable of perceiving. Yet, nearly capsizing the vessel, I managed to pull myself aboard. For a brief moment, I noticed a pair of boots, and was without a doubt certain that I was not alone. Before I had a chance to communicate with my supposed comrade, however, I noted a streak of warmth on my frigid body. Just below my ribcage, bloodying the dirty uniform I was given, protruded a pipe of jagged metal. I had seen my blood before. My brothers ensured of that, but I'd never seen so much of it. The night was bright with flames, but each second I gazed upon my wound stole away my sight. Deaf and blind, my body delivered me to the abyss of unconsciousness. When I came to, the sky was red with morning, and Victorious was nowhere to be seen. I wasn't sure whether the ship had sunk completely or whether the currents had carried me to some uncharted corner of the sea. Yet my confusion about my whereabouts was quickly dispelled by a dire realization. I was not sharing the lifeboat with a fellow sailor. My supposed comrade had been divorced of anything that existed above his ribcage. The sheer sight of broken bloody bone peeking out from where his chest would have been almost sent me into another fainting fit. Yet, with great difficulty, I steeled myself. With the corpse resting on the other side of the boat, I busied myself with checking for supplies. They were, to no surprise, yet many tears, completely lackluster. The radio in the lifeboat could easily trace its lineage to the Second World War and worked about as well as its veterans live. The box with the flare gun was completely cleaned out. The meager ration packs were hard as stone, and the first aid kit was filled with fetid used bandages and rusted instruments. I negotiated my will to survive with the horrors sprawled on the other side of the boat and pulled myself onto my stomach to face the sea. I had hoped to catch the sight of land, or perhaps another vessel, yet all I was greeted with was a shivering plain of emptiness. From time to time, my body let out horrid ululations which I had no control over. The sounds were terrible and chilled me to my very core, but the fact that I had regained my hearing provided some respite from the burning pain in my side and grief in my heart. When the sun set, however, I found myself wishing I was deaf once more. It started off as quiet bursts of sound which could, reluctantly, be attributed to the movement of the waves rocking the boat. Yet, the longer I lay on my stomach, the darker the night grew, the less I found myself able to hold on to the falsehoods which kept me sane. The headless sailor on the other end of the boat, he was speaking to me. His vocalizations held no message but that of panic. He did not speak in words, but rather in shouts and blabbers which held only the most obscure connection to the human tongue. As the night carried on, the boat, with no aid from my person, began to rock. The raving of the dead sailor was unbearable, yet I could not bring myself to turn around. Instead, I let the swaying of the boat rock my exhausted body to sleep. When morning came, the headless corpse was silent once again. I knew, however, that my sanity could not bear a repetition of the night prior. With great difficulty, and even greater disgust, I navigated myself to face the dead body of my comrade. His corpse was still mangled from the chest up, and there was no conceivable explanation for the raving and rocking that had taken place in the darkness. I brought it upon myself to be rid of the cadaver. Before I pushed the body overboard, in great anguish and between guttural dry heaves, I searched the sailor's person. I had hoped for some sort of an identifying mark so that I would know who I had briefly shared the boat with, but instead I only found a half-empty pack of cheap cigarettes. These I took, and once the corpse had been set to float in the dark waters, I partook in one of them. I had no shelter from the sun, and my wound had not improved. Yet, even with my lungs weak from a steadily encroaching fever, I found some semblance of pleasure in the burning tobacco. The cigarette satisfied a craving long ignored, but also fended off the hunger pangs. The water, although possessing a bitter metallic bite, was drinkable, The ration packs, however, brought back no memories of human food. During my first day in the boat, hours later, after I had disposed of the corpse, I attempted to eat. When my teeth could not bite through the solidified chunk of mystery, I even dipped it into the sea in an effort to soften the food. Nothing worked. For 2 sunsets, I attempted to find a way to consume the meager nutrition I was left with, until, on the following morning, in a fit of delirium, I threw the ration packs into the sea. Man underestimates the dependence his intellect has on the world of flesh. As my wound festered and the sun beat down on my face, I quickly became a slave to frenzied visions beyond the realm of comprehension. During the night, even with the corpse shed well out of sight, I could still hear the manic raving of the faceless sailor. The boat still rocked back and forth as if I had been an overgrown bloody infant being forced to sleep by a vengeful parent. Above me, in a sky untainted by the shine of a civilized world, the stars watched me like 1,000 curious eyes. During the day, when I lay on my belly in hopes of forgetting about the sun, I found the most colorful of plump fish watching me from the water. They followed the motion of the boat, floating with their gills nearly peeking out of the water, watching me with their primitive eyeballs. I could shift in the boat as violently as I pleased. I could scream and sing and stomp, yet the fish never left. It was only once the thought of seizing one of them to fend off starvation hatched in the back of my head that they suddenly retreated into the dark depths. When I had committed myself to catching one of them, the sea turned clear. It wasn't until my hope had faded long later that they once again appeared. Were the thought to catch one of them to rise again, they would retreat. Were I to reflect upon my sluggish, diseased limbs and decide they were not fit to grasp a living thing, the fish would suddenly return once more. As the days passed, my delirium grew. I would often see other vessels on the sea, both of the enemy and those of my own. I screamed and hollered at the ships, regardless of the flags they flew, and demanded rescue, or at least deliverance from my suffering. None of the vessels stopped. In the back of my fevered mind, a quiet voice told me that the ships were mere phantasms, and in my tired heart, I knew it spoke true. Yet I raged at each rejection all the same. I elected to ration the cigarettes and only smoke once after each sunrise, but the amount of days I had spent stranded at sea is a mystery to me. The cigarette pack could not have contained more than 10, perhaps 12 cigarettes. When, in my utter mind-flaying boredom, I counted the crushed filters I had set aside, I counted dozens, sometimes hundreds, of spent cigarettes. The pack never seemed to grow any more empty, but then, one day, it did. My skin had grown deathly pale, with tinges of yellow by then. I existed in a state of complete delirium, tainted with the harrowing realization that my body should have died, yet it was refusing to do so. There was only one cigarette left in the pack. With as much gusto as my shambling limbs allowed, I crushed the paper box and threw it as far as I could. Using the dead sailor's lighter, I lit up the final bit of tobacco and resolved to, hopefully, expire along with it. It was only with a couple of puffs that the violent rays of the sun relented. A blanket of cool, thick fog descended around me and mingled with impotent puffs of smoke I was leaving in my trace. In the distance, hiding in the fog, I could see the faint outlines of land. I was nearly certain of them being just another fabulation of my rotten brain, yet out of caution, and perhaps a little hope, I found my free hand dipping into the water and paddling towards the mysterious silhouette of land. The boat was far too heavy, and I was far too weak to move it under regular circumstances, but somehow, as if the water itself was pushing me along, I made progress. Soon, I found a crushed cigarette pack floating off in the sea. Next to it sat a glass bottle with a piece of parchment inside. I quickly retrieved the bottle, yet just as I grabbed it, I saw another and another. The closer the boat drew to the landmass obscured by fog, the more numerous the bottles became. Without a shred of rational thought, I took to swiping the bottles from the water, ripping out the corks with my aching teeth and trying to make sense of the parchments inside. I could not. The script used in the papers was wholly foreign to me and written with poor discipline. Even though the scrawls spread through the pages like written spiderwebs, I still grabbed one bottle after another. It is with the final bottle, that I retrieved before touching land, that I finally found a message I could read. The letters were bent in all different angles, and the words were clearly written under an appreciable strain, yet its message was decipherable. Beware Neptune, for he does not take kindly to the world of men. I scarcely had time to make sense of the words before my lifeboat hit land. Or, more accurately, something resembling land. When the lifeboat first came to rest, I was certain that the shore of the cryptic island was covered in sand. The moment I pulled my drained body over the side of the boat, however, I found there to be no beach. The ground beneath me was scaly and warm, as if I was resting on the skin of some mammoth sea beast. Slowly, ever so slowly, I could feel the ground shift beneath me, as if it were a slave to the breaths of some unseen monstrosity. Yet my confusion over my environs did not last for long. Out in the fog, peeking out of the curtain of cool smoke like bright seductive fingers, I saw fruit. The bounty only held the slightest resemblance to the crop man knows as the banana. They were curved and yellow and plump, yet they hung off of thick vines of seaweed strewn about as if discarded by some careless giant. I knew not of where this fruit came, and the stinging pain in my stomach barred me of such foolish inquisitions. I was a man only in the broadest definition of the category. In truth, I was an animal freed from a cage of fever and starvation. I did not ask from whence the food came. I only crawled towards it and prayed it would bring me deliverance from my pain. The fruit was soft and tasted unlike anything I could recall. It had a consistency of meat, shredded chicken to be exact, yet it tasted like an eerie mix of strawberries and fish. Though not particularly appetizing in the abstract sense, in my nigh starvation, the fruit forced painful tears of joy from my eyes. One after the other, I ripped the pungent crop off the vines until I could eat no more. Then, with my stomach ready to burst and unfamiliar ground beneath me gently swaying, I slept. Whilst I was trapped at sea, I had many dreams which bled past unconscious into the world of flesh and bone. The rocking of the boat, the babbling of the headless sailor. I could scarcely tell the difference between the realm of sleep and feverish waking. Long had I slept like this, yet when I tasted of that strange fruit, when I slept on that scaly earth hidden in impenetrable fog, I was wholly surrendered to the realm of hypnos. I dreamt deeply, and I dreamt long. I was a fish. I had scarce awareness of once being a man, but I swam through the dark waters and had fins and gills. At first, I traveled alone, with much anxiety about where I was meant to be going, but soon, from the corner of my slitted eye, I spotted a flash of colorful scales. At first, the other fish bid me no attention. They swam in their directions and, to my relief, had no issue with my distant escort. I still had no idea where I was swimming to, but the flow of fish swimming ahead of me made me feel safer. Steadily, our flock increased. Both in body and spirit, we all grew closer. The slitted eyes around me no longer ignored my presence. They stared at my primitive soul in understanding. The fellow fish even, in a way that would be discomforting to a sober man, smiled at me with their queer lips. I, as a fish, smiled at them in return, finding comfort in the company and camaraderie. We traveled in good spirits through the water and grew even larger as a crowd, and then, when all one could see was fish, we all started to descend deeper into the water. The temperature had dropped considerably, and the darkness turned all notions of community to vague suggestion, yet our flock simply grew closer and bumped into one another to remind ourselves of company. We traveled so in the darkness, until slowly I sensed a faint light in the distance. Until then, I had been keeping pace with the rest of the fish, not getting in anyone's way and traveling at the speed the pack required of me. Yet when I noted the pale blue shine in the darkness, I found myself drawn to the front of the group. I pushed my way past the other fish. They were not angry. On the contrary, in the steadily gaining light, I could see them grin at me as friends. Their teeth were not those of fish, but rather reminiscent of humans. I knew their lips and dentures were wrong, but much time had passed since anything had looked at me with kindness. I smiled back and continued to push forward to the front of the pack to get a better view of our destination. As the source of light grew nearer, its outlines were starting to take shape. We were all swimming towards some sort of radiant gate which sat at the bottom of the sea. It was not the only fish that had sped up. The whole group had picked up its speed. We were all drawn towards that magnificent light, yet there was no animosity. Each fish swam as quickly as it could, knowing that no one would be left behind. I reached the front of the flock and then even further. Even though somewhere in the back of my primitive skull, I knew that I had once been a man, I swam further than all the other fish. The water around me grew pleasantly warm, and a touch of the light felt cosmically correct on my scaly face. I was very near the celestial gate to which my primitive mind drove me when I noticed something was floating ahead. At first I thought it a piece of driftwood long sunk, or perhaps a bushel of seaweed. Yet the nearer I drew, the slower my fins moved. Before me, floating in the water, sat a blood-drained sailor divorced of his body at his abdomen. With his one arm, he furiously pumped his fist, and with his bloodless lips, he screamed in a silent frenzy. As a fish, I could not hear him, yet I was sure that it was the same headless sailor that had shared my floating cage with me. A sudden terror washed through my cold-blooded flesh. In an instant, I desired to change my direction and move away from the burning ethereal light. My passage, however, was blocked with a wave of fish. I desperately struggled against their smiling onslaught, but on a tide of bodies, I found myself being pushed closer to the gate. The heat of the water became unbearable. The one-armed sailor grasped me in his hand. He squeezed and I breathed in water. I woke human to a dark night, dripping wet, coughing up salt water. In my shock of having appendages once more, I jumped to my feet. It wasn't until I was bent over trying to rid my chest of whatever seawater was left in it that I realized I was once again capable of standing. The festering wound in my side, in fact, was no more. What was left of the shrapnel which harmed me dropped impotently at my feet. Before I could celebrate the return of my meager health, however, the moon stole my attention. It burnt bright in the sky and looked much larger than before. There was a horrid feeling in the back of my exhausted mind that it was no longer a celestial body but a living thing. I stared at the moon until, in a terrible rotation which chilled my heart, it looked back at me. The moon was a giant fisheye and was staring straight at me. Before I could make full sense of the horror in the sky, the scaly ground beneath my feet started to shift once more. This time, the movements of the isle were not of gentle breaths. They were shudders and pushes and shakes. The fisheye in the sky stared at me, and I became certain that the island was trying to get rid of me. Not wanting to be thrown into the water, to be at the mercy of what dwells within, I quickly retreated back to my lifeboat. Around the lifeboat, much like in those starving days I had spent at sea, a school of brightly colored fish sat with their mouths above the water, watching me. Some smiled their grins of human teeth, others raved in the familiar tones of the headless sailor, yet I had little mind to pay attention to them. The movements of the aisle stole away all my attention and sanity. Just as I set my feet onto the lifeboat, the mass of scaly flesh behind me rose out of the water. With the sudden vacuum, the water was set wild, and I barely prevented myself from falling into the raging depths. I held on to whatever I could, hoping that staying afloat would spare my life. One look above, however, drew my hands numb. Words do not exist to explain what I saw. I can only say that the being of tentacles and eyes and claws that rose out of the sea was nothing which man, or God, should ever commune with. I tried to avert my eyes from the beast, but my body had lost all will to move. In utter paralysis, I stared up at the abomination above. I watched the many eyes of the horrid Neptune, and they watched me in return. They watched me, and slowly, far too slowly, my consciousness retreated in a faint. I woke up in an overcrowded hospital on the mainland. No information was given to me about where I was found or what my state was. When I was proven to be lucid, I was vacated from my bed and sent off to the street. I tried to regain entry into the building to find answers to what I had seen, or at least to find forgetfulness and medication. It was the elderly security guard of the hospital who intercepted me and who I tried to detail my misfortune to. I told him of the battleship, and of the lifeboat, and of the headless sailor and horrid living island. He believed not of my words, yet he took pity on me. From his pocket he gave me meager change and suggested that if I am who I claim to be, I should take the bus back home. So I did. With my mind gripped with confusion and the aftershocks of frenzied fever, I traveled back home to the family that thought me dead. They rejected me at first, but once it became clear, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I am of their blood, they accepted me in open, public embrace. On the first night I spent back in the manor, my mother sat at my bed with wine on her breath and told me how she worried for me and how she would never let me be taken to war again. Only a few days later, however, my father woke me in the presence of a uniformed man with scattered metal on his chest. My survival had been most fortuitous, the military man said, as my father proudly held vigil at my bedside. Yet my service to the motherland was not done. I was to be promoted and recognized for my heroic survival. I was to be given control over a vessel. The mere sight of the uniform made my nerves unmanageable, but I did not break into madness until I heard the name of the ship which I was to command. The Neptune. The time of my departure draws at hand, and soon they will knock on my door. I have smoked my final cigarette and committed all that I could to paper. There's not much left for me to do but to grab that ornate letter opener and ensure that I never see the sea again. Beware Neptune, for he does not take kindly to a world of men. Originally, I had ventured to the Tatras to find an old sanatorium. Kafka, when his tuberculosis had flared up, had stayed at the facility, and I thought it a curious pilgrimage to see where the eerie man spent his days a century ago. I left the organized, safe, civilized confines of the city in hopes of coming back home with a quaint souvenir. I thought it a pleasant way to spend the weekend. I thought wrong. I found no sanatorium. Instead, I found the world to be a much more inhospitable place than I thought it before. I also found, in great detail and against my will, why it is that in the village of Ulthar there is a law that no man may kill a dog. I came upon the settlement completely by accident. The hills of rural Slovakia are a labyrinth thousands of years in the making, and the roads that lead through them are quite often construction fraud made physically manifest. I was lost. The navigation in my motor had refused to cooperate, and the maps which I thought I had packed, I had not. I was lost and covered in sweat, and the fuel gauge in my motor was starting to run dangerously low. It is in this state of panic and confusion that I spotted a Slovnaft gas station that stands next to the settlement of Ulthar. The station itself, sitting before the aged village and eternal mountains, is a curious sight. Bright and yellow and filled with electric lights and pumps, the structure looks like it came from a world wholly foreign to its rural surroundings. I chuckled at the absurdity, wondered what Kafka would make of it, and then hurried to fill my gas tank. My motor was the only car present at the pumps, yet I was not alone. The moment I stepped out, an old heavy hound was quick to meet me. Brown and black and grey with age, the animal trotted up to my car and sat itself in my way. The hound's eyes were milky with years, yet even past their murkiness, I could see a familiar expression. The dog was begging for treats. Having no scraps, nor an interest in befriending animals, I ignored the dog and focused on the gas pump. The man behind the register was way beyond the years of retirement, but he was animated and clearly still in touch with his intellect. He was overjoyed to see a customer, especially one with foreign plates. The old man, completely needlessly, pointed out where each product was in the station and then finished off his tour of the cramped premises by making a sales pitch for the 2 solitary hot dogs that were rolling around beneath the heat lamps. I declined the offer of processed meat, but grabbed myself some bottled water from one of the coolers. As the old man tapped away at the register, he inquired of my travels. Seeing no need for secrecy, I told him. Upon hearing of the sanatorium I was searching for, he gave me a knowing glance and said it was not far from where we were. Without being asked, he provided me with the directions to get to my destination. I heartily thanked him, and then, as he continued to struggle with the register, I strolled around the minuscule station. It is then that, by chance, I became aware of that peculiar law concerning the dogs of Ultár. Right beneath the cashier's desk, in prominent view and in 3 languages it stood. Under the penalty of death, no man in Ultár shall kill a dog. Out of curiosity, and because the old man seemed to have trouble with the cash register, I asked about the strange law. Why was it displayed so prominently? Was the law meant in jest, or did the village of Ultár carry a steeper punishment for animal abuse than would be the European norm? In my inquisition, all pretense of commerce had been abandoned. The old man immediately launched into a history lesson fueled by the zeal of a lifelong raconteur.
"There,"
he said, pointing out to the village beyond the plexiglass window of the gas station.
"There once stood a mighty manor, and now only its skeletons remain. You see those stones that circle the center of Ulthar? Those, back in the days of serfdom, were walls. A mighty manor stood here hundreds of years ago, and those walls of stone protected it. The family that lived within that manor was exceedingly cruel in their ruling of the land. Their taxes left the peasantry hungry, and their laws were strict, and they were quick to use violence to make examples of folk. Yet what that cruel family was known for most of all was what they did to the village dogs. In a village, a dog rarely sleeps alone. There are shepherds and guards and live in the yards or in the fields. In Ulthar, however, the villagers have always kept their dogs inside after sundown. It is a tradition from the olden days when the manor still stood tall. The serfs would hide their dogs inside of their cabins, for the noble family that ruled over them would steal them otherwise. No certain record exists of what horrors happened behind those walls. Some villagers thought the nobility had simply killed the dogs for pleasure, or perhaps as a part of some demoniac feast. Others suggested that the dogs were being used for purposes of dark magic or dark science, or a mixture of the two. No one knew what happened beyond those walls. save for the wails and howls the villagers would hear if a dog was ever unaccounted for. For years this tradition went on, and the common folk were simply happy that the family that ruled over them didn't form an appetite for their livestock or children. Then, many years later, once the cruel family living in the manor had become a fact of life to the villagers, a caravan of a travelling circus rolled into town. Jugglers and fire-eaters and men wearing strange headdresses of bone and horn flooded the town square with their presents and goods. In this caravan there was an orphan boy who had lost his parents to war and disease, and was only left with a dark mutt puppy to keep him company. The child had drawn a poor lot in life, but as long as he was in the company of his yelping black hound, he was happy. For the first 2 days of the caravan's stay, the boy and the dog were inseparable. It wasn't until the evening of the 3rd day, when the boy had lost track of his pet while playing with the local children, that the puppy went missing. Well until sunset, the boy walked through the village streets and called out to his companion, yet no dog presented itself. When the sun finally set, and the boy was called back to the camp, he made the villagers promise him that they would keep his dog safe were they to chance upon him during the night. The villagers agreed, but they knew full well what fate awaited the boy's cherished pet. During the night, those that drank and those that slept lightly could hear the sounds too familiar to the people of Ulthar. The puppy had ended up in the manor. When in the morning the townsfolk sought to tell the boy about the fate of the puppy, they expected him to be heartbroken. The dog was, after all, his steadfast companion, and he loved it, the way only a child can love a pet. But when the boy was told of the fate of his puppy, he did not weep. Instead, he simply turned in the direction of the manor, knelt, and started to recite some sort of prayer. The words and motions of the child were completely alien to those of the village, but when the fellow nomads of his kind noticed the boy, they joined him in his communion. Soon enough, all the foreigners in the village were on their knees, praying in a queer way in the direction of the manor in which the dogs would disappear. It wasn't until a couple of minutes into the strange chant that the skies above started to shift. It was a cloudless morning, yet as the prayers went on, a cover of darkness descended as if it were birthed by the sky itself. A storm, the likes of which Ulthar had never seen before, descended on the village, and only on the village. Thunder and hail and rain beat against all within the limits of the city, yet the world beyond was dry and calm. Sensing foul play in the nomads' prayers, the nobility sent out the guards to disperse the crowd. The strange folk retreated to their camp in the outskirts of the village, yet when the storm refused to relent, the guards chased them even further. Even with the nomads gone, however, the storm continued to persist, making any field work fruitless and driving all of the villagers indoors. The storm dragged on well into the evening and showed no signs of weakening. The villagers wept for their rain-soaked crops, prayed to God that he find mercy on them, but then, knowing there was work to be done in the morning, they slept. To the crackling of thunder and flashes of lightning, the people of Ulthar lay in wait for the morrow's labor. The morning brought an end to the storm, but it also brought something infinitely queerer than the people of Ulthar had ever witnessed. When they awoke, they found all their dogs gone. At first it was feared that the family of the manor had kidnapped the hounds in the night, but the animals were quickly found in the streets of the village. They were safe and healthy, but strange, as if drunk on some magnificent liquor. The dogs stumbled through the streets with their bellies filled to burst. They would reject all food and drink and simply stroll through the sunlit streets, basking in the warmth of the morning. The dogs were queer but safe, and the villagers took comfort in that. Furthermore, the manor was quiet and the guards were nowhere to harass the townsfolk. The village of Ulthar considered this a blessing and simply went on with their labor. It wasn't until the morning of the following day that they were to find why the manor had been so silent. A guard emerged from behind the gates of the manor. He was bloodied and bruised and barely holding on to life. The people of Ulthar did the most they could to keep him alive, but he perished not far from the manor where he had received his injuries. As he went, they say, he spoke of a night of horrors. He spoke of the ground beneath the manor shaking all throughout the storm. He spoke of the grass turning to mud and that mud drifting apart. He spoke of creatures, wild hounds that rose from the earth, with the flesh barely holding on to the bone. He spoke of a terrible battle, and then he spoke of the dogs of Ulthar. The dying guard swore that as the demonic beasts of the earth descended on him and his comrades, the dogs of Ulthar were among their midst. They walked on their hind legs, with their paws in the air. As the eldritch beast from the mud ripped away the throats of the guards and the family which they protected, the dogs of Ulthar followed behind, feasting on what was left. When a brave group of villagers ventured into the manor, they found enough blood and bones to bring truth to even the most absurd allegations. The earth was disturbed, and no one dared to disturb it further to this very day. History books tell of the family and their entourage dying of a wolf pack, and perhaps that is what the rest of the world beyond the valleys must believe. But the people of Ulthar know the truth, and because of that truth, we have our law, for we never want to see our dogs walk upright again.
With that, the old storyteller tapped at the till once more and produced my bill for the gas and water. I paid what I owed in silence. The old man's story had been entertaining enough to make me forget about the old sanatorium I had been looking for, but my thoughts of Kafka were quickly replaced with thoughts of skepticism. "Has a dog ever been killed in Ulthar since?" I finally asked. The old man nodded and then pointed to the old dog sitting by the gas pumps.
"His great-grandmother 7 times over. Zukrik might not know it, but his blood ties to Ulthar history."
The hound outside seemed far too old to hear, but at the mention of his name, Zukrik got up. He trudged over to the automatic doors of the gas station and didn't enter until they were fully open. With a low grunt, the dog laid down at my feet and looked up at me as if I might feed him. "And did anything happen?" I asked, ignoring the hound. "Was there a storm? Did demoniac dogs rise from the earth?"
"Well, that depends on who you ask. The outsiders say that the whole story of the manor is just an old wives' tale. They say that over the years dozens of dogs have died in accidents or through malice. They say that the only laws that apply in Ulthar are laws which politicians have decided. If you ask the skeptics, they'll say nothing out of the ordinary happens when a dog dies in our fair village."
The man shrugged, and, with that, the heating lamps over the hot dogs went dark and the conveyor belt ceased to move. Calling to the hound, the old man took one of the hot dogs and cut off a small bit with a knife he seemed to have hidden in his sleeve.
"Can't feed him the whole thing,"
the old man said, dropping a small piece of hot dog to the ground.
"The old dog would choke. They forget, unlike wise old humans, what moderation is."
We stood there in silence, watching the old hound sniff and chew and groan at the small cut of meat. It wasn't until he fed the dog a second piece of processed sausage that the old man spoke again.
"Outsiders say that the old story of the dogs of Ulthar is a fabulation of the highest degree, but they're wrong.
They lie to their peers and to themselves in an impotent effort to convince everyone the world is much plainer than it is. Yet, dear traveller, if you'll believe me, I know the truth. Only one dog has been killed in Ulthar since the night the manor fell. Only one dog has been killed, and when she was killed, all the hounds of Ulthar rose to their hind legs.
The old man said, the flame of the raconteur starting behind the spectacles again.
I know this because I was there to see it.
The story seemed to be confidently set in the realm of folklore, but the old man's passion for telling it kept me fascinated. I inquired of the old man to tell me more, to spin another tale of the dogs of Ulthar. In response, he told me that a man shouldn't talk about the past without a drink. Then, with an acrylic grin, he nodded to the liquor shelf behind him. I told him I would happily buy him a drink, and he happily turned on his heel and retrieved my purchase. His choice of drink was a plastic shot glass of what I presumed to be vodka. He emerged with not one, but two. When he pushed a single serving of liquor to me, I rejected it. I was, after all, driving, and though I was unfamiliar with the alcohol laws of Ulthar, I was sure that the Slovakian police would not approve of me operating my motor under the influence. In response, the old man told me that there are no police in the hills I would be taking to get to Kafka's old sanatorium. Without giving me much room to negotiate, he undid the seal on my drink and then grabbed the last hot dog in the heating machine. He placed the processed meat in a bun, told me where the ketchup and mustard are, and then he produced my bill. A hot dog and 2 shots of vodka. €3.50. It seemed like a reasonable price to pay for the old man's tale. He undid his own shot glass and raised it in a toast to Cifra, the dog that had been lost many years prior. I never knew of the dog, but I raised my plastic glass in her honor as well. Before he drained his shots, the old man took a big bite of his hot dog. Not knowing if this is a local custom, I took a bite out of mine too. The processed meat had a most unpleasant taste, yet the cheap liquor washed it away with all the other sensation in my mouth.
It was the end of the war,
the old man said, feeding his old hound another slice of meat.
The valleys here are deep and things often get lost. We didn't see any fighting for the most of it. Germans scarcely made their way down here. It wasn't until the end of the war that a group of Soviet soldiers made their way through Ulthar. There were about 30 of them, and they were accompanying a lone, broken-down tank. They were hungry and tired and completely lost. At first, some of the villagers would welcome the soldiers with food and drink. When the donations proved to be insufficient, however, the troops started to freely take from the people of Ulthar regardless of whether they were willing to give. They traveled through the village and saw what each house had, and if they liked it or thought that it could fetch a kopeck somewhere, they took it. During this grand transfer of wealth, the soldiers came upon a certain home where a man with 3 beautiful daughters lived. They had not hidden sufficiently, and soon enough they too were to become a gift to the liberators. In an effort to protect his daughters, the man told the soldiers of a better reward. Across the road, there lived a family who had connections to a bartender in one of the nearby cities. In the house across the road there surely would be some spiritus, which would ease the minds of the war-weary soldiers. Thrilled by the promise of pure alcohol, the soldiers went across the street and demanded what they considered to be theirs by birthright. I do not know if there was any spiritus in that house, but what I do know, as a matter of fact, what everyone in Ulthar knows, is that in the house across the street lived a shepherd dog by the name of Cifra. Now Cifra was accustomed to chasing wolves and bears and wild hogs. She had a wild streak about her, and when the strange men entered the courtyard of the home, she made no effort to hide it. While the soldiers interrogated her owner, she barked. No words from the soldiers, or from her master for that matter, dissuaded her. Cifra only grew louder and angrier with every second of the exchange. Then, perhaps because she started at him, or because she simply made him scared, one of the soldiers raised his rifle and shot the dog dead. The life scarcely went out of the dog before the rain started to fall. A storm which Ulthar had not witnessed for hundreds of years came down upon the village and dispersed the arguing crowd. The soldiers retreated back to the edge of the village to secure their equipment, and the families of Ulthar retreated back to their homes and locked their doors. Once again, a torrential rain had descended upon Ulthar as punishment for the sins of the cruel Manor family. The wind tore at the roofs of the cottages, and the hail wreaked havoc upon the fields. The thunder that rocked above the village was deafening. So terrible was its howl, in fact, that no one could hear the firefights at the outskirts of the village. My father had told me that the story of the dogs in the manor had been a complete lie. He was, much like you, a skeptic of the old tales. As he cowered from the storm, he assured us all that there had been clouds gathering all afternoon. He tried to explain everything away with the most common of views. My father held on to his rationality as tight as he could. Yet when he saw our family dog rise to his hind legs, he was left speechless. I loved the dog the way only a child can love a pet. He had been my steadfast companion for all of my few years. Zukrik was his name. I have never owned a dog with any other name since. I knew Zukrik better than anyone else, yet that night I could not recognize him. Standing on his hind legs, he looked as if he were begging for treats, yet there was no joy in his eyes. The dog was as if possessed by some foreign force which made our whole family strangers to him. He stood on his hind legs and pawed at the door, and he grew increasingly agitated when he found it locked. When the queer beast started to bark and snarl at my family, my father lost all of his skepticism and unlocked the door. I tried to follow my steadfast companion into the rain, but I was held back. The dog was going off to do what Ulthar dogs are to do, my father said. He was right. When the rain finally cleared and the world outside drifted out of the storm, the village of Ulthar was treated to a sight which vindicated the law of old. As a child, I was not allowed to look upon what was left of the camp for long. The memories, however, those will haunt me until my dying days. They say that the bones were buried in the churchyard and that the tank was driven up to the hills to be reclaimed by the forest. Of these things I do not know, for I was but a boy and children were not entitled to the world of adults. What I do know, though, is that the earth around the manor, beyond those remnants of white stone where grass now grows, I know that the earth around that old manor was disturbed. No one dared to touch it, and for seasons no grass grew there. Most of those who were there to witness that night now lie at the cemetery. Soon I'll join them too, God willing. But until then, until I lie dead, buried next to my dear old wife, I will happily tell a stranger why no man in Ulthar is to harm a dog.
Even with the cold hot dog in my hand, I found myself clapping when the old man finished his tale. I, of course, did not believe a word of his story, but the passion with which he weaved his tale left me a fan. There were no other customers, and the old man seemed more than willing to indulge me in another story, yet the sun was starting to set across the hills, and I feared driving in the dark. I asked the old man to repeat the directions to the sanatorium again, and then, with some sadness, I bid my goodbyes. When I left the gas station, I found my feet light from the cheap vodka shot the old man forced upon me. I had not eaten much on my travels, and I have never been one for liquor, yet I still found the ever so gentle lack of balance in my steps to be emasculating. It is, perhaps, because of my imbalance in my steps that I took pity on the old dog. The hound had followed me out of the gas station. I had little doubt about why the dog was following me. He was, after all, a simple creature whose biological priorities were firmly in the realm of food. having a cold hot dog in my hand that I wasn't interested in eating made me the most interesting character in the immediate vicinity. When I got back to my motor, the old hound outpaced me and sat himself directly in front of the door. His milky eyes made their intentions clear, and I felt charitable. With some effort, I pinched off a bit of the processed meat and threw it to the hound. He was beyond ecstatic to receive the treat. The hound quickly scarfed down the thumb-sized bit of hot dog that I provided, but he was hungry for more. At first, I attempted to pitch off another piece of the processed meat, but the hot dog was wet and greasy and far too messy to deal with. Perhaps it was the liquor. Perhaps I took the old man's warning as another fabulation. Perhaps I just wanted to give the dog a treat he would never forget. Regardless of what my motivations were, I gave up on partitioning the meat and gave the hound the whole hot dog. The joy in the hound's failing eyes was palpable. In an instant, he transformed from an animal aged to an animal in his prime. Without any hesitation, he retrieved the meat from the bun and trotted off a distance from my car to eat in peace. I considered my charity a good deed. For a couple of minutes, at least. The old man had given me simple instructions on how to get to the old sanatorium, yet I still made an attempt to coordinate my path with the navigation system in my motor. It took me a while to get the address to match the instructions that were given to me, yet with some effort, the two sets of directions unified into one. I flipped on the radio and turned the ignition and was ready to depart the village of Ulthar. Yet, a drop of rain stopped me in my tracks. It had been a completely clear afternoon when I arrived at the gas station, and the skies were just as clear when I left. In my short time in the car, however, clouds gathered above. Dark clouds. Clouds which descended from the sky as if they were birthed outside of the Earth's atmosphere. They gathered and rained and leaked lightning. In the rearview mirror of my motor, I could see the gas station hound. He was no longer happily gnawing on a stick of processed meat which I gave him. He was lying on his side, motionless, his massive chest absent of all breath. The dead dog quickly disappeared in a curtain of thick rain, and my aspirations to check on the animal were displaced by my fear of the old man's reaction. Without much thought, I stepped on the gas pedal and drove away. I had hoped to outrun the storm, to find shelter in the old sanatorium, to dispel all thoughts of the Ultár legend being true. My hopes proved to be deeply misplaced. The storm followed me from the village and into the hills. It tore away all sight from the road and rendered the world beyond my headlights invisible. Had I met another car on those thin forest roads, I would not be here to tell my story. Had I met another car, both me and his driver would have died a quick fiery death in a patch of nearly untouched land. The roads were, however, empty. I do not know if I took a wrong turn or whether my navigation led me astray on purpose, but in my rain-drenched blindness, I drove the motor off of roads of cement to roads of packed earth. By the time I realized I was driving on terrain the automobile was unaccustomed to, it was too late. Beneath my wheels, the road turned to mud. For a while, the motor still crawled through the forest path, yet soon enough, even that inkling of movement came to rest under the strained howl of the automobile's engine. I've been sitting here for nigh 30 minutes. The moment the storm started up, I found doubts in my heart about whether the legends of Ulthar were truly a fabulation. It did not take long for that doubt to turn into certainty. With the rain beating against my roof and windshield, I have been rendered deaf and blind to the outside world. Yet past the downpour and steadily advancing darkness, I can see them. Silhouettes of beasts have been circling my car, growing closer and closer with each rotation of their demoniac circle. I know from whence those beasts came. Every fiber of my being wants to reject the knowledge as a fable, as a childish story told by a senile man. Yet I know from whence those beasts came. The circle grows closer and closer with each rotation, and the outlines of skeletal hounds start to peek at me through the rain. Yet there is something else. Past my headlights, I see another group move. They do not stand on all fours like beasts. No, they stand on hind legs like men. Yet they are not men. They are dogs. They are dogs, and they carry in their eyes the queerest of expressions. They are dogs, and they have been possessed by something foreign both to the realm of man and animal. They are the dogs of Ulthar, and once again, they walk on hind legs. Out of the curtain of rain, a leader emerges. He presses his paw against the handle of the door. He moves in a way in which a dog should never move. He presses his paw against the handle of the door and he tries to open it. The door is locked, but the dog is not alone. His brothers and sisters join him. They join him and they bark and howl and scratch, trying to get inside. Standing on their hind legs, they beat and rage against the motor. They stand on their hind legs, ready to deliver the punishment which meets any man who dares to kill a dog in the village of Ultár.
Oh, Elliot, I apologize dearly for being late. The bus, the tram, the whole of Prague seems to have conspired against us meeting at a timely fashion. I thought I would burst a blood vessel waiting for the 174. The timetables in the city seem to be wholly improvised. If it wasn't for Google Maps, I would have made it here even later. But look at me, blabbering about bus schedules when I have not seen my dear friend for over a season. Elliot, how are you? Tell me of your exploits. How I got here? Well, 20 minutes late, my dear friend, but how I got here? In a concrete sense? I rode a bus to Angel, and from there I took a tram over the bridge. The same tram, mind you, that had an unfortunate convergence with one of those cursed electric scooters. Damn city government needs to tighten their leash before someone loses a limb. I pray you don't take my tardiness too much to heart, Elliot. In fact, to lessen the burden, let me buy the first round. I still live in Prague 13. Yes, I'm used to the jeers. Not real Prague, they say. Well, where is a man working on an artist's salary to live? The panel houses are peaceful, and I do not have to contend with the screaming tourists in the summer. I am happy where I am. But yes, I still live a distance away. Yet for a chance to meet with you, Elliot, no distance is too great. Let us drop the subject. Tell me how... The subway? Yes, my journey could have been expedited into but 15 minutes if I rode the subway. I chose not to ride it. Elliot, I once again profusely apologize for making you wait, but it seems to me, and I pray this is purely phantasm on my part, that you are trying to steer this conversation towards something very specific. Have you, perchance, been talking to that Dutch snake Van Open? Has he, perhaps, told you stories about me? Damn him. You needn't say a word, Elliot. I am good at reading faces. Van Open is a scoundrel with a mouth full of lies. One day that man will get hit so hard he'll pack his bags and go back to swimming in the hate canals. Curse him and all he does and says. Yes, it is true. I no longer ride the subway. It inspires within me an unbearable discomfort which I wish to avoid at all costs. Reason? Oh, Elliot, can we not talk of other things? We are both, after all, men of art. There are so many interesting discussions to... Don't say a word, Elliot. I am good at reading faces. I know there is no dissuading you. Do not think that I will buy you a drink for bringing me to a trap, however. In fact, if you want to hear the full truth, I will require my drinking expenses covered. Never told the Dutchman the reason. He simply observed I had an aversion to the underground and found that alone to be entertaining enough to warrant a rumor. I would swear you to secrecy, Elliot, but I trust your judgment enough. If you ever see Van Open spreading slanderous lies about why I avoid escalators and eschew all trains, do not hesitate to correct the record. The man has the brain of an imbecile, so I am sure whatever explanations he dreams up will be laughable. But it is better to be on the side of righteous truth than on the side of swindling lies. Aside from defending my honor, though, Elliot, please do not spread my story further. The tale is horrible, and frankly, not suited for civilized company. But it might also arouse the attention of the authorities, and that I could not abide. I wish to leave the past in the past and move on with my life. You see, Elliot, the reason I fear the subway is not just a horrible story. It is also, I am fairly certain, connected to the disappearance of our mutual friend, Victor Vernerzeig. Keep your voice down, Elliot. The bartender here serves a cold, cheap pilsner, but they are not ones for shouting. Especially not the names of such tenor. But yes, even after a little metropolitan society of the artistically inclined snubbed the man, I stayed in touch with Victor Vernerzeig. His beliefs were undoubtedly vile and belonged not to the century or to the century past, but you know me, Elliot. I am no sunflower child. On the contrary, I am a slave to the brush, and I will follow all who can teach me how to wield it with skill. The views which Vernerzeig would proclaim on the purity of blood and equality of sexes and certain salient historical facts deserve to be, at the very least, ignored. Yet when the man spoke of art, I was his most rapturous audience. For Prague, and perhaps Europe as a whole, has never seen such a skilled craftsman as Victor Vernerzeig. Do you recall the first night at the Spider's Lounge? When all we knew of Vernerzeig was purely by his creations and not by his theories? Oh, how those crowds chattered. Oh, how they wanted to meet him. Even the snake Van Open, who I have never heard utter a complimentary word to anyone but dogs, said that he would like to buy the artist a drink. There's very few things that I can agree on with that Dutch troglodyte, but Vernerzeig's genius was certainly one of them. There was something about those paintings, be they the cloudy city landscapes or morose portraits, that cut straight to one's soul. The brushwork, the balance of light and darkness and color and composition, those were all flawless. Yet flawless craftsmanship can be learned. A gifted artist needs not much practice, at least in comparison to one lacking all vision. Yet, I believe, with enough repetition, even the most dim of minds can be brought to create functional art. Vernerzeig's art, however, was not just the masterwork of craft. It elevated itself well above the conventionally attractive with untouchable discomfort rooted in horrid inspiration. Now, Elliot, I know that what we saw in the Spider's Lounge was but a tiny fraction of the artistic depravity Vernerzeig was capable of, but even then, I knew that I was witnessing the work of a titan. When Victor entered the lounge, he entered a newly forged celebrity. I tried my best to push past all the admirers, but as you can see, Elliot, I do not possess a fighting body. For much of the night, I sat at the bar, sipping on depressants, hoping to either bolster my spirits, to cut through the conversation, or to bring myself forgetfulness. I, of course, had to do neither. When Victor started to speak on the topic of ethnicity and skulls and burdens, the crowd quickly dissolved and I had my chance to speak with the man privately. Do not give me that look, Elliot. I've spent 2 months following around Baurova to comprehend her composition and tolerated Cleric's terrible smell while I picked his brain for his theory of color. Even spending time with that sea urchin, Van Open, has given me a glimpse into how he crafts motion where there is none. None of these characters would, of course, provide any arguments in favor of ethnic cleansing, but the point still stands. For knowledge of technique, Elliot, I am willing to expose myself to many unpleasant things. A great many unpleasant things. I was prepared to listen to hours of nonsensical phrenology and impotent rants about the hierarchy of races, but Elliot, to truly comprehend Vernerzeig, I had to witness something much, much worse. Once he was banned from the Spider Lounge and all the other establishments where artists congregate, I took to calling on Vernerzeig at his home on Paris Street. Paris Street. Yes, Elliot, how can you be surprised? You know as well as I do that the tenor of Vernerzeig's beliefs is only held by the exceedingly poor and the lavishly rich. Vernerzeig, with his polished cane and 3-piece suits, belonged to the latter category with no doubt. Vernerzeig's wealth was generational. He didn't speak too much of his ancestry, for he was too preoccupied prodding the ancestry of others, but with a little research, I found his family to be a noteworthy name of industry. It is with their money that he afforded his Paris Street apartment. It is with their money that he... Well, I'll get to that shortly. The facade was decorated with cherubs and gold, yet Vernerzeig's home was all but luxurious. The only place in which one could take a seat was a worn-out couch, and the kitchen contained nothing but an espresso machine and empty packages of couriered food. The rest of the space was taken up by paintings. Horrible paintings. paintings which were wholly different from the ones I witnessed at the Spider Lounge, but, in their own right, significantly more disturbing. They depicted strange rural scenes of folk that straddled the line between man and beast. Though these suffering figures were dressed like medieval peasantry and stood on 2 feet and had human faces, there was something distinctly rat-like about them. A certain beadiness of the eye, a misshape in the tooth. The features weren't wholly discomforting on their own, but when the figures were taken as a whole, there was an eerie chill about them. What's more, the scenes depicted in the oil paintings were harrowing beyond comfort. The images seemed to tell some sort of a tale of great suffering. On one, a starving family of those strange folks gathered around a diseased field. In another, a frail old man was holding the hand of his long-dead wife. In another, a fat-faced man in tattered robes of nobility hung strung up by his neck. The images depicted made, even me, a hardy man of arts who has seen his share of demented works, uncomfortable. What broke my discomfort into sheer terror, however, was that the paintings moved. Well, not exactly moved. Words escape me here, Elliot. They existed and breathed and suffered in a way wholly indescribable. Though they sparked fear in my heart, they also set aflame a roaring fascination. I demanded to know how Vernerzeig had achieved such strange mixture of shadows and presence, yet at my questions, the man simply laughed. They were not his paintings. It was simply a collection he had amassed over the past couple of months from a promising artist out east. He too found the paintings to be fascinating in their style, but Vernerzeig kept none of his own work in the house. Some of the paintings, which he considered to be mere practice and of no engagement of his skill, he lent to establishments such as the Spider Lounge. The work he was proud of, however, Vernerzeig said, he kept at a studio. At the mention of a studio, I, of course, insisted access, but in response, the man just laughed. The studio was off limits to all but his closest friends, and he barely knew me. I was only invited to his domicile for coffee and conversation. For 3 weeks, Elliot, I visited that crowded apartment. His brew was bitter and his conversation was even more so. The paintings on the walls must have been rotated regularly, for they were never the same. The motifs still revolved around a strange, suffering peasantry, yet the characters seemed to have aged with each visit. They seemed more broken with each visit. My fascination with Vernerzeig's paintings exposed in the Spider Lounge was ultimate, yet as the weeks dragged on, I forgot their eerie splendor. The rat paintings too had lost their charm. Whilst I still found the technique and spirit of the paintings to be stimulating, whatever interest I had dissipated in the impression that the longer I watched the strange folk, the deeper their suffering got. I'd steeled myself in a resolve that I would cut Vernerzeig just as the rest of artistic society did, but on that final day of bitter drinks, as if he could sense me slipping away, Vernerzeig met me in the hall with work of his own. When he said the pieces exposed in the Spider's Lounge were some of his poorest work, I thought his words to be playful arrogance. Yet Vernerzeig was nothing but right. Compared to the piece which he shewed me in his Paris Street apartment, all his previous works seemed like the scribbles of a child. The painting depicted the Church of Our Lady before the Teen from the Old Town Square, not a 5-minute walk away from Vernerzeig's apartment. The masses of tourists were gone, and even though the architecture seemed proportional, there was a terrible weight to it, as if the city were about to sink into the ground at any moment. The painting was a masterclass in perception and composition, but that was not what took my breath away, Elliot. What truly filled my heart with terror and fascination was a wholly incomprehensible quality of the painting. When viewed head-on, the frame held an empty scene from the city of Prague. With a blink or a squint or just a momentary glance at the canvas, however, Elliot, the city was on fire. I cannot explain it, even now. When first faced with the bizarre optical illusion, I was left wholly speechless and had to seat myself on a ratty couch to regain my composure. The man took great pleasure in my discomfort. As I stared at the painting, desperately moving my mouth in effort for words, Vernerzeig laughed. He laughed a horrid, malicious, venomous laugh, as if my fear, as if the burning inferno that flashed across the oil paints, as if it was all the funniest joke to him. When I finally gathered my senses enough to ask him how he achieved such an effect, he told me, with a great sadistic grin, that it was a matter of inspiration, a matter of lights and environs and subject, but most of all, a matter of inspiration. And in no such place was there as much inspiration as there was in Vernerzeig's secluded studio. I begged Elliot. I never got on my knees, but I contorted on that couch like a man in sickness. I clasped my hands and promised my eternal gratitude. He took great pleasure in my begging, and he prolonged it for as long as he could. It wasn't until my desperation started to turn to anger that he finally scoffed and relented. I could take a peek at his studio. I was to meet Vernerzeig at the Moostek subway station by the remnants of the bridge the following evening. I was to dress in a manner which would attract no attention. I did not sleep that night, for my mind ran wild with attempts to explain Vernerzeig's strokes. I wondered of the paints and canvas and man all until morning. It was only once the sun was well in the sky that I relented myself to shallow asleep. When I woke, a few hours later, I felt groggy and unrested. Those few hours of shut-eye, however, would be the best sleep I would get for the next month. Elliot, perhaps you can leave this story for another night. Look how my hand quivers. It is as if my body is still shaken by what I witnessed in Vernerzeig's studio. My mind, perhaps, too, is less healed than I would have liked to believe. If you'll insist I continue, and judging by your face you will, fine, but I will ask that you pour me something stronger. Tell the bartender to bring us some cognac. Not any of the cheap stuff. My pain is great and I require appropriate medicine. Do you know of the old bridge in the Moostek station, Elliot? Ha. What do you foreigners know of our fine city? The old bridge is from whence the Moostek station gets its name. You do know that Moostek means little bridge in the local tongue, yes? Don't say a word, Elliot. I can read a face very well. The short history lesson is in order. The old stone bridge used to connect up the old town of Prague and the new town of Prague back in the 16th century. When the moat, which the bridge spans across, was filled in the late 18th century, the bridge was forgotten by both man and time. It wasn't until the year 1976 that the Gothic wonder was uncovered during the construction of the subway. You see, Elliot, Prague has been around for well over a millennium, and as the centuries piled on, the city grew to cover its past. The history books say the city rose to combat the floods. Perhaps that is true. If you call the river Vltava by her primordial name, Vilt Ahwa, it translates from primitive Germanic to wild water. Proven by history, the Vltava can be cruel, but I think there was something else driving Prague from its roots. There is a darkness beneath the city. The ground through which the subway runs, Elliot, should have been left untouched. I arrived at the old bridge at 8 o'clock sharp. That, to me, was evening enough. I was sleepless, but filled with an artist's hunger. Such strong was my desire to learn the secrets of Vernerzeig's technique that I nearly broke my legs rushing down the stairs. I was restless with fascination. I wanted an immediate reveal, yet I was forced to wait. The first hour was the easiest. It passed in a snap. As time piled on, however, its passage became sluggish. I was nearly ready to give it all up and go drown my disappointment back at the spider. But then, I felt a hand on my shoulder. The shock, Elliot. At first I thought I was being assailed by a vagrant. I was nigh ready to swing my fists and shout with all my might. Then I recognized the figure. It was Victor Vernerzeig. Yet instead of his three-piece suit, he wore a filthy hoodie. His cane was replaced with a worn can of Kozel, and his long locks were matted beyond recognition. But in disguise and silence, he spoke to me. Vernerzeig told me to follow him and to keep a distance. So I did. I expected the studio to be near the subway, yet the moment we rose the stairs, Vernerzeig led me to another set of stairs, which took us to the yellow line. On the escalators, Vernerzeig nearly toppled a crowd of drunken Brits, and I nearly lost my hat when I leaped after him into the subway carriage. We rode, at a distance from each other, in the direction of Zlichine. I was wholly lost as to where we were going, and Vernerzeig vacated his seat whenever I approached him. It wasn't until the station of Smíchovské nádraží that he acknowledged my existence. It was with a simple nod to get off the carriage. We had arrived. Elliot, look at my hand. Look at how it shakes. Perhaps we can leave this conversation for another time, for a calmer... Fine. I will not argue with that expression, but Elliot, have the bartender bring us 2 more glasses. If I am to continue with this tale, I need to soothe my soul. While he pours, do you know how the name of Smíchovské nádraží translates to English? The Station of Laughter. No, Elliot, I am not joking. They say that the name comes from an old legend from the days of kings and emperors. A knight was to be beheaded at the high castle for disrespecting the king. Before his sentence was carried out, however, he asked for one last ride on his horse. The knight forced the horse to leap from the top of the high castle down to the river below. The animal died on the spot, but they say that on quiet evenings, if the air is still and your ears are sharp, you can still hear the knight laughing in victory. What I found in Smíchovské nádraží, however, is no laughing matter. What I found was... here comes the bartender. Na zdraví, Elliot. Bůh požehnej nám. Vernerzeig walked out of the carriage and onto the platform, and I followed him. He led me to a door. I care not remember exactly where that door was, for I never planned to enter it again. It was but a short walk, and no stairs were taken. The door led to a tightly dim hallway that smelled faintly of mildew. Now that we were alone, I called out to Vernerzeig. The man didn't even turn his head. It wasn't until we were standing in a freight elevator at the end of the hall that he acknowledged my presence. In the flickering fluorescence of the old freight elevator, I could see madness dancing across his face. He did not greet me or comment on where we were descending to. Instead, Vernerzeig spoke of fire. At first, he spoke of it in abstract terms, of the mystery of it, of how it elevated man from an uncivilized animal to a being of knowledge. Vernerzeig spoke of how the fires that burnt in Alexandria, the fires that ate up the steppe in Dornod, how they differ on a basic metaphysical level from the childish bonfires we cook our sausages over, or the pitiful flame that a gas stove emits. You see, Elliot, the Vernerzeig family has long held a searing interest into the nature of fire. For over a century, they had experimented in corners of science not accepted by polite society. They discovered, with great certainty but little specifics, that fires are not mere exothermic reactions dictated by the known laws of physics. With breathless fascination and malice in his eyes, Vernerzeig insisted that fires are portals to a realm wholly incomprehensible to man. That rusty elevator, as we descended, I considered the man's theories to be pure fantasy, yet now, as we sit here, Elliot, I would wager all I have to say that there was truth to the madman's words. For the place to which we descended, for the location of Vernerzeig's secret studio, was the site of a failed experiment on the nature of flame. Well before the doors of the freight elevator creaked open, the air was assailed by an overwhelming stench of smoke. Though in the dim light I saw no wisps, it quickly became clear to me where the source of Vernerzeig's strange cough stemmed from. No man who would spend an extended period of time in that poisonous lair could emerge healthy. Descending in that elevator, however, I had no concern for my own well-being. I was far too hungry for knowledge of Vernerzeig's technique. I was a glutton for secrets, and soon, for my cravings, I would be punished. The doors of the freight elevator pulled apart to reveal a ruined factory. I am not one for the cold world of engineering, but if I was to guess, the machinery had been damaged in some sort of an explosion. The conveyor belts and instruments were melted and shattered, but I did not spend long inspecting them, for on the charred walls hung paintings which seized my attention and chilled me to my core. When Vernerzeig labeled his work from the Spider's Lounge to be some of his worst, it was not an exaggerated boast or joke. It was a clinical fact. These paintings, Elliot, Oh, these paintings, they made me forget the smell and melted machinery and the sheer insanity of the studio's location. I was wholly and unapologetically consumed by the art. Words cannot describe it. If I were to tell you that the paintings depicted quaint scenes of modern Prague, of the streets of Žižkov at night, or the tram lines of Holešovice in deep winter, or the view from Letna in the summer heat, that would do it no justice. If I told you that these masterful pieces were painted in a style that married realism with a dark sort of Art Nouveau, as if Mucha had dispensed of his bright colors in exchange for utter despair, then, maybe, with a dose of imagination, you might begin to merely comprehend a fraction of the craftsmanship. You see, Eliot, much like the painting I had witnessed in his Paris Street loft, the creations Vernerzeig hung around the abandoned factory floor had an unfathomable quality when viewed for a prolonged period of time. On first sight, the landscapes were simply empty city streets, but, and this effect seemed to strengthen with my utter fascination, they were also aflame. The city, taken as a whole, was burning in the images, yet I could find no single trace of red on the canvas. When I demanded Vernerzeig tell me how he achieved such an effect, he would snort and remind me that a painting is a matter of inspiration, and, to a certain extent, good lighting. The ill fluorescence in the main hall scarcely lit up his pictures, but when I questioned them, Vernerzeig laughed and said there was another light under which he practiced his art. Much brighter light. A light he would show me soon enough after I had my fill of his paintings. Eliot, I cannot understate the haunting nature of the art on display and how much of it there was to soak in, yet my hunger for answers quickly drew me towards Vernerzeig's true source of vision. See the sweat that gathers above my brow, Eliot? The radiator next to me is dormant. I have long removed my coat. The sweat, my dear friend, is my body's rejection of what I saw. Yes, another glass is in order. Just look at my hand. But might I suggest we also step outside for a breath of fresh air? I trust that you still smoke and that you're still inclined to provide me with my comforts. Now, careful with the drinks. Just tuck them under your coat. The bartender does not take kindly to glass being taken outside. The machine. That's what he called it. It stood dormant at the far end of the ruined factory. I didn't even register its shape in the darkness. It wasn't until Vernerzeig flipped a switch on the wall that the contraption became visible to me. A face of jagged metal with its jaw broken loose by a mighty force. At the gullet of this disturbing metal head sat an array of nozzles which emitted flames. Only a few of the fire emitters were functional, but they were enough to light up the eyes of that horrid iron face. Out of pure self-preservation, I looked away from the burst of heat. Vernerzeig, however, took great offense at me shielding my face. He grabbed me, savagely, and insisted that I stare into the mouth of that eldritch contraption. He shouted, past the steady increasing roar of the inferno, that if I was to comprehend this art, I would have to see what sat in the fire. The heat was nigh unbearable, but I steeled myself. I watched the flames, and, at first, I thought myself strong to bear the blistering fever spreading through the hall. Yet the searing pressure against my skin quickly became the least of my worries. Eliot, there was something in those flames. Something alive, or perhaps more than alive. Something that defied all logic and sense. Yet I saw it. I saw it move, and somewhere deep in my gut, somewhere at the core of my genetics, I knew the beast that stirred within the flames was something which should not be seen by man. Yet I fought against my instincts. I kept my eyes set on the burning machine, hoping to comprehend that which is incomprehensible. I watched the beast, with the flames shift and grow and burn even brighter with each moment. 2 blue balls of light rose from the bottom of the flames. They traveled through the throat and up towards the holes where the machine's eyes would be. It wasn't until the beast of flame looked back at me that I truly lost my mind. Vernerzeig tried to restrain me further, but in pure, primal panic, I struck the man in the nose. As I sprinted towards the freight elevator, I expected Vernerzeig to chase me, or at least to curse me for the bodily harm, but he didn't. Instead, Vernerzeig laughed. He laughed with such malice and force that I could hear his mad cackles past the roaring of the flame and the grinding of the elevator. Well, after the smell of smoke dissipated and the familiar scent of mildew filled my nostrils, I could still hear the lunatic howl with laughter. It is but a few moments after I scrambled out of the subway station that I met Von Open. He was reading a book, waiting for a carriage to take him in a Cherny Moss direction. Had I been more composed, he wouldn't have even noticed me. Yet composed I was not. Elliot, I was a blabbering, shaken mess. I know I may not seem the most composed to you right now, with the sweat and the quiver in my hands and the tears, but the state I was in when I first fled that horrible place would make my current condition seem the definition of copacetic. I believe the Dutchman asked me to accompany him on the subway so that we might grab a drink at the Spider. I told the man I no longer ride a subway and wanted to leave it at that. You, of course, know Von Open. The Dutchman does not let things rest. I do not recall exactly what I said to Von Open, and I do not care to try to remember. Either way, I certainly made enough of an impression to warrant him spreading news of my phobia. No, Elliot. It's not just Smichowska Nadraji that is off limits to me. It is the entirety of the underground. What I saw, down in that ruined hall, I wish to steer as clear of it as possible. If I never descend beneath the ground level of the city for the rest of my life, I shall die a happy man. Or, at least, a sane man at any rate. And of Vernerzeig's disappearance? I guess I heard of it before the news properly spread. After the horrible scene on the ground, I never visited the man or attempted to speak to him. I had seen enough, and I had resolved to never involve myself with him again. It wasn't until weeks later, while I was recovering from my nervous bout in the mountains of Slovakia, that I was contacted by the authorities. It was Vernerzeig's doorman that alerted the police to my existence, and I presume it was someone from the Spider Lounge that passed on my number. I did admit that Vernerzeig and I had spent some time together, but I dared not tell them of his studio. They questioned me when I came back to Prague, and for a brief moment I thought they had some suspicion about me being connected to his disappearance, but the matter was eventually dropped. Elliot, I would also suggest we drop the matter as well now. You see how this story has worked me up into a state, and although I endured it for you, and for the sake of truth, there is nothing left to tell. Let us return to our table and speak of better times. What I think happened to Vernerzeig? Oh, Elliot, can we just drop the subject? I don't know. I don't know, and I do not care to wonder. Perhaps he simply decided to leave the country without telling anyone. Maybe the fumes from his studio finally got to him, or perhaps he decided to join the beast of fire in its own realm. I do not know, and I will not speculate. Oh, finish your cigarette. It's getting cold outside. I didn't bring out my coat.
The first time our paths crossed, it was only for a moment. It was a drunken night of decadence, and my mind was far more focused on the visiting goddess from Sharm el-Sheikh, whose sneezes made my heart flutter. I paid little attention to the old man smoking in a corner of the ice bar. In the fevered days to come, however, his infirm form wholly consumed me. As I lay in my sickbed, terrified my life was to end at the ripe age of 20, I could see him. Whether I was dreaming or residing in my aching, shivering body, I could see him. The torn lab coat, the cracked yellowed skin, those piercing blue eyes, they stood vigil by my bed and haunted my dreams. Mayhaps those 2 weeks of sickness were a warning, a pistol shot from the universe urging me to keep my distance. Mayhaps, had I listened to my body, or even quit my job after my injury, I would have been a far saner individual today. But I did no such thing.
Once my sickness calmed, I retained my employment as a drunk and indulged the mystery of the old scientist. With blind fascination, I spit into the faces of the fates and pursued my interest in a mysterious patron. It is through my own folly that I became privy to the terrible tenor of dark science in which Dr. Zimmer forged his name. It was back in the innocent year of 2012 that I met the man. After trading for my studies of life sciences at the Charles University, I further fled from responsibility and secured employ as a pub crawl guide. My job, if one could call it that, revolved around the scores of intoxicated youths that would visit Prague throughout the summers. Each day, 6 days a week, I would provide the tourists with 2 hours of free liquor and then take them on an excursion of 2 overpriced bars and a club. The bands I ran through the city would usually comprise of men, mainly young British boys to be exact, but every couple of nights an opportunity for romance would present itself. As it would happen, on that fateful eve, I was struck by Cupid's drunken arrow. She hailed from Sharm el-Sheikh and had a body which intoxicated on sight. Originally, she had been traveling Europe with her family, but had heard many whispers that Prague is a city best visited alone. She had no interest in spending time in a decadent Gothic capital in the company of her doting mother and impatient father, but for my company, she had quite the appetite. It is not easy, however, to hold a conversation with a beautiful woman when 100-strong horde stands at one's back. Much of the pleasantries we shared were interrupted by dry heaves from the dark alleys and screeches of concerned neighbors from high above. The Egyptian often disappeared back into the mass of drunken flesh for which I was responsible for, yet her melodic voice cut through all chants and jeers like a harp through television static. It was also through her sneezes that I could locate the goddess. With a soul worthy of marble, the high-pitched expulsions provided the gentlest suggestion of flaw in her perfection. The sneezes made her human. The sneezes only made me oh so more enthralled by her. The pub crawl would always finish at a multi-story club, which was the mecca of Prague's tourist traps. On the nights I found myself too exhausted, I would retreat back home through the night buses to sleep. On most nights, I would find my favorite group of drunks and take them somewhere more amicable. On that night, however, I descended to the frigid ice pub in the basement of the club. I did whatever I could to transpose my love to another establishment, but she was far too taken by the concept of a bar made of ice. The goddess relented the change to a quieter locale, yet she would only do so after cooling off in a tourist trap. Having never been to the ice bar myself, I accepted her terms. Even though I had shed my name badge and simmered down my shepherd's voice to a conversational volume, the drunken horde still recognized me as their leader. As I tried to talk to the goddess in line for the ice bar, I was constantly interrupted by shoulder grabs and shouts and cheap liquor shots I had no intention of sullying my throat with. That night, much like many nights prior, the drunken horde disrupted my search for love. It was not the drunken British children that were my undoing on that Gelid Eve. It is not they who sent me careening down the frozen hallways towards the edge of sanity. It was the staff of the drunken Tower of Babel that sealed my fate. The ice pub was popular, but small. The purveyors of the multi-story club were fully aware of the novelty a bar made of ice would provide in her blistering summer heat. They were also well versed in the folly of drunken crowds in confined spaces. For this reason, the attendance of the ice pub was limited to 20 drunks and 10-minute intervals. Though the line, much like all lines comprised of the intoxicated, had little order, I could see at least 40 persons stood before us. There was no rush. I consider myself safe in the presumption that me and my goddess would spend 20 minutes waiting, then 10 minutes shivering, and then we would be on our merry way to warmer pastures. Just as the door closed on the first batch of drunken adventurers, however, I was swept up in a change of plans. At the back of the first Arctic expedition stood 2 women from the Isles of Britain. Though both were drunk, one was deemed to be far too much of a vomit risk to grace the frozen floors. In one swift motion, the bouncer liberated the woman of her ice pub jacket, and, when searching for a replacement, he picked me out of the crowd. The bouncer and I had never spoken. He knew not a word of English or the local tongue. Though the towering man was not metropolitan in his dialect, he spoke fluently the only languages which his trade requires. With his mountainous stature and scarred face and poorly healed prison tattoos, the man spoke the twin tongues of violence and intimidation. I put up the faintest bit of protest when he shoved my arms into the Arctic coat, yet I did not allow my body to resist. The shores of the Vltava are filled with bloody faces that have made that mistake. Just before the door behind me shut, I could hear the goddess behind me sneeze. I did not take her sternulation as a sign from the universe that I should change my course. I took it as a sign that she would still be waiting for me when I left my frozen prison. Even with 20 drunks, the ice pub was far too crowded. The few ice chairs available had melted past the point of furniture and served only as vague shapes to lean on. The frozen bar was staffed by 2 figures dressed in hazmat suits who lacked any capacity for quick motion. The drunks busied themselves touching the walls and sucking at the beer bong made of ice, but I did my best just to focus on the large digital clock at the center of the pub. 10 minutes and counting. I thought I could bear the time apart from my goddess in relative peace, but within the first 2 minutes of my frigid adventure, a terrible noise bounced through the icy halls. The second British woman, the one that didn't seem like a vomit risk, she was screaming. She wanted to know where her friend was and, more importantly, she wanted out of the pub. I expected the staff to let her out, but instead they simply turned up the music to keep up the good mood. She calmed down, for a couple minutes at least. Occasionally she would bang on the door and demand to be let out, yet for most of her stay at the ice pub, she sulked. When there were but 2 minutes left on the clock, however, her hectic energy returned. In tones that couldn't even be drowned out by early 2000s hits, the woman started to scream again. When her calls for freedom yielded no results, she started to tear at the jacket she was given. The clothing was tough and clearly designed for more inhospitable corners of our globe, yet she was tougher. Just before the doors of the ice pub opened, she ripped through the jacket. After she forced her way through the door, all she left behind was a pile of thermal stuffing and fake broken nails. My goddess was in the next batch of people destined to enter the ice pub, so I did not bother exiting the frigid hall. Just before she entered, however, her phone rang and she ducked out. With a knowing glance, the towering bouncer shut the doors to the ice pub once more. Above me, the digital clock once again started to count down 10 minutes. I tried, once more, to bear my cold and uncomfortable environs by keeping track of time. This time, however, there was something much more distracting in the pub than its screaming tourists. Not far from the ice bar, there sat a small set of steps leading down to what I presumed to be some sort of a maintenance room. From that door, wearing a lab coat that would soon become very familiar to me, emerged an old, feeble man. He seemed to have been summoned by the British woman's outburst, for he seemed to be quite interested in the pile of stuffing she had left behind. Quickly, however, his attention changed. As the strange old scientist puffed away at his hand-rolled cigarette, he kept his piercing blue eyes trained purely on me. I am no stranger to offbeat old men hanging out in the back of pubs. I do work in Prague after all. Yet there was something different about the man in the lab coat. With his sickly yellow skin and matted hair, the man looked horribly unwell. There was a stare that truly sent discomfort crawling up my spine. I was not in the mood to make merry with drunken strangers, but I desperately needed distraction from the old man in the lab coat. Even though I was fully aware of the deluge of orally transmitted diseases that traveled through the underbelly of our gothic capital, I pressed my mouth against the frozen beer bong at the center of the ice pub and indulged the tainted liquor in hopes of finding forgetfulness. I drank at least a dozen watered-down vodka shots, and someone threw in a beer that, even despite the ice, managed to be lukewarm. My experience at the end of the frozen teats was not a pleasant one, yet when I re-emerged, the strange old man was gone. The clock had also made progress. When the door to the ice pub opened for the third time, my Egyptian goddess finally entered. She was much more enthused by the frozen environs than I was, yet after 3 or 4 minutes, she too grew unimpressed. The jacket she was given was the same one the British woman had torn apart not 20 minutes prior. The ripped-up clothes provided little warmth to my love's tender flesh. My first visit to the ice pub was of no trifle for my body. The second visit gently challenged my immune system. It was not until the third time the clock rolled back its 10-minute mandate that I found my lungs aching. The cold was getting to me. but the steadily strengthening sneezes of my Egyptian goddess made my heart ache. In misguided chivalry, I switched jackets with her. In drunken folly, I sealed my fate. We shared our first kiss in that frozen bar, and then we shared a few more in a nearby spider's lounge. That I recall. The rest of the night, however, has been stolen away by the skull-rattling fever that followed. I have faint memories of being loaded into a taxi by some of the bohemian types that hang around the lounge, but sickness has wiped away all detail. I woke the next morning, consumed by agony and drenched in sweat. The lifestyle of a pub crawl worker is not a healthy one, and I had fallen sick many times prior. It was never as horrid as my condition was then. For 2 weeks, I existed in a constant state of fever and coughs. Whatever disease my body had contracted was a cruel one. My roommates, children, just as I, were of little help in my time of sickness. I was brought a solitary cup of tepid ramen when my condition proved to be too frail to walk to the kitchen, but I was left in isolation otherwise. As I arrived in my sickbed, my chest ached with a burning suffering and my mind was seized by terrible apparitions. Most of the phantasms were the ethereal visions of a man whose soul is seized by fever, yet within all the horrors my brain projected, there was one constant: the old scientist. He stood by my bed when I was lucid. He traveled with me through the fetid vapors of my dreams. The old scientist never made any attempt to speak to me or interact in any other fashion. He simply watched me from a distance with his piercing blue eyes. After 2 weeks of the cursed sickness, I was far from healed. As decrepit as my lodgings were, however, they did not come for free. I needed to pay rent. On my first day back at work, I felt far from healthy. My chest ached, the veins in my hands were bloated, and my mind existed beneath a thick layer of mental fog. Luckily, my job at the pub crawl did not require me to be particularly sharp. At that point, I had taken my visions of the old scientist as being a product of my fever. I was unsure if the scientist had even existed to begin with, and I made no effort to check. When I first put on my name badge, I was convinced that I would never enter the ice pub again. By the end of the night, however, I was in deep need of cooling down. It had been a historically hot day. Even with the sun down, I was sweating as one would at midday. Initially, I thought that some fresh air and libations would do my sickly body well, yet they did not. By the time my horde had reached the 5-story club, my body felt patently unwell. Briefly, I considered calling myself an ambulance, but foolishly, I chose to cool my body in the ice pub. The cool environs of the frozen bar felt like they could calm the burning discomfort brewing in my abdomen, but they did not. Moments after I found myself back in the ice bar, my hearing and sight started to fade. I tried to lean on one of the frozen chairs, but they were far too melted to hold up my weight. The first thing I saw were his sharp blue eyes. The next was the burning ember of a cigarette. I was lying on a metal slab in a room filled with vials and beakers and microscopes. When my unfamiliar environs finally dawned upon me, I panicked. In distress, I shoved the old man away and readied myself for a speedy escape. My push had propelled the frail scientist backwards, yet my body would not travel. Exhausted, I collapsed back onto the metal slab. Disoriented, dehydrated, signs of jaundice, potential inflammation of the joints, heavy alcohol consumption, poor sleep diet, possible drugs. Not good, not good. Though my push sent the scientist falling against the shelves of tinctures and vials, he quickly regained his footing. Very young, very unhealthy. If poor behavior is kept up, precious life will be wasted. Not good, not good. The man spoke with rapidity and gentleness unbecoming of his appearance. Briefly, he turned away from me to pick out an improvised package of foul-smelling balm. With his piercing eyes once again burning into my skull, he handed me the medicine. Apply this to your hands and neck. Effects are not instant but quick. Should relax the hearts and restore energy. Perhaps it was lightheadedness that still seized my mind. Perhaps it was the ethereal blue of his eyes. Perhaps I am simply an idiot. Either way, Without much argument, I scooped up a healthy helping of the grey ointment and applied it to my knuckles. Though the scientist said otherwise, the relief was instant. Within moments, the ache in my fists soothed and the veins in my hands receded to normalcy. Putting even a small helping of the balm on my neck relieved my discomfort even further. Though I introduced myself to the scientist by my full name, he never gave me his. He simply identified himself as John, the ex-assistant of the once great cryobiologist Ulthar Zimmer. Dr. Zimmer had died many years prior, but John had taken it upon himself to continue his mentor's studies. The Gelid tenor of science Zimmer practiced was shunned by all modern scientific organizations and required interminable sub-zero temperatures. With little funding available, the old scientist negotiated a laboratory beneath Prague's infamous ice pub. As the old man spoke, I could see the staccato of his words hang in the air in quick puffs of mist. The vials and tinctures that occupied much of his makeshift laboratory were coated in a thin layer of frost. The temperature in the room was undeniably beneath the point of freezing, yet in my shorts and t-shirt, I wasn't the least bit cold. When I remarked upon the incongruent climate, the old scientist laughed. "You know little of the cold. You know so little that you might as well know nothing at all," he said, in another torrent of little puffs. "Big pity Dr. Zimmer lectured before the digital age. Very big pity. If you could see a single lecture, you would ask very different questions." The old scientist seemed to be getting ready to educate me on the concept of cold, yet I quickly excused myself. Even though my aches and pains left my body with the help of John's strange balm, the memory of my inflamed lungs still burnt bright in my chest. Fearing a return of the sickness which kept me bedridden for so long, I fled the frozen laboratory and emerged in the back of the ice bar. That night, I slept soundly. The questions of the strange old man, however, did not leave my mind. By the end of my next shift, I found myself standing in a long winding line to enter the ice pub once more. When I knocked on the metal door that led down to the makeshift laboratory, the kitted out bartenders paid me no mind. When the door finally opened, the feeble scientist greeted me as if I were an old friend. I had abandoned all interest in the sciences when I had fled the university, but talking to the strange man reminded me of my past passions. When he spoke of Dr. Zimmer's research, John's words burned with an irresistible academic zeal. He saw Zimmer as a true visionary whose brain could steer humanity from the brink of disaster. If Zimmer's theories could be put into practice and the true potential of the cold could be unlocked, John claimed, the world would be ushered into a new frozen golden age of prosperity and peace. John's passion for cryobiology was unmatched, and so were his theories. He spoke of the cold not as a simple thermic reality, but as a force beyond the comprehension of man. He spoke of peaks and valleys within the scale of heat, hidden corners in our primitive measurements that could unlock biological properties which modern science couldn't comprehend. The old scientist spoke of freezing temperatures not as a state of matter, but rather as a separate world from ours. I, for the most part, did not put too much stock in John's opinions. It was their fantastical nature that interested me, not their real-world application or accuracy. Briefly, I made an attempt to learn more about Ulthar Zimmer, yet John seemed to be much more content talking about the man's studies rather than the facts of his life. When I tried to figure out when he died, or at least where the doctor had lectured, John immediately descended into abstractions. "When I met Dr. Zimmer, he was very old like me. I was young, just like you," he said to me one night as I visited. "Charles University, the university you so smartly fled. He lectured there, but it was a different time. It was a different regime." I never took it upon myself to ask John's age. It seemed impolite to do so. I simply presumed he was talking about the communist government. I spent much of my evenings that summer in the company of the old scientist. He would regale me with the tales and theories of Dr. Zimmer, and, on the occasions where I arrived bearing certain work-related injuries, John would provide me with various magical tinctures and balms to ease my aches. I enjoyed my time with the old scientist, yet as the tourist season came to an end and my nightly bacchanalia morphed into an ever-repeating shift of babysitting drunks, I found the pub crawl badge to be a burden. Around November of 2012, I left the pub crawl and made a transition to a more sober aspect of the tourism industry, the tour guiding world. Although I traded my name badge for an umbrella and my morning hangovers for a bigger paycheck, I would still drop by to visit the old scientist whenever I found myself around the ice pub in the middle of the night. I still thoroughly enjoy the conversations about how life could be preserved and extended through the aid of the cold. Yet the drowsiness my midnight visits imbued in my morning tours provided to be far too much of a bother. Month by month, I started to visit John's frozen laboratory less and less. As seasons changed to years, I stopped thinking about the strange man and his theories altogether. It wasn't until this summer, more than a decade later after I had first met the scientist, that I thought of him again. Even though the old man had stopped being a part of my day, I would still walk by the ice pub on my way to work every morning. The passage in which the establishment is located is one of the many clogged arteries of the Prague tourist trade, which becomes utterly impassable at noon when the crowds climb out of their hotels. In the early morning, when all the pilgrims sleep, the passage usually smells of last night's urine and other misadventures. That fateful morning, the passage carried only the stench of ammonia. Moments after I registered the smell, I could see its origin. The door to the ice pub had been pried open. The whole passage was slick with water. The ice pub had been vandalized, and it was melting. Though I had an early shift to get to, I abandoned all responsibility and ventured into the once frozen hall. The misshapen suggestions of chairs had turned into flimsy icicles. The massive frozen beer bong was now a puddle. The large timer that sat above the ice pub was hanging by just a few wires. With his yellowed skin and fading hair, John had never looked like a prime example of health. The state I found him in, however, was unrecognizable. The man was sitting in a pool of melted ice on the floor, shivering in madness. All the sharpness had left his words, and his eyes were dull and glassy. With slurred speech, John said something about a group of drunk tourists breaking in around sunrise, but the longer he spoke, the less structure his sentences possessed. The old man clearly needed help, but he turned nigh feral when I tried calling an ambulance. With fury in his wavering voice, he labeled all modern doctors to be criminals and charlatans. With what little energy he had left, he delivered one final lucid instruction. "Ice," he rasped. "Bring me ice. Bring me ice before I perish." Prague is a city that has yet to become fully comfortable with the concept of air conditioning. Ice is a commodity not easily acquired in the streets. After a sprinting search through the winding streets and some frantic research on my phone, all I was able to cool off the old scientist with was a couple of dozen popsicles that I managed to buy from a Vietnamese corner store. My old friend was in dire straits. It was also heavy tourist season. There was no way that I could miss work. I promised John that I would contact someone from the ice pub management and get them to summon a repair crew to bring the laboratory back to its frigid normalcy. Though he looked like he could no longer understand my words, I promised I would come to check on him during my lunch break. It took me much of my walk to work to finally get someone from management on the line. Even then, they were not particularly interested in what was going on with their establishment. Yes, someone broke into the ice pub in the early morning hours. They were aware. Yes, a repair was scheduled at some point in the future. When repair was to take place, however, was none of my business. I spent much of my 3-hour morning tour thinking about the old scientist. I had little understanding of what was wrong with him, but our evening talks made it clear that he needed the cold to stay healthy. As I rushed back to the ice pub during my lunch break, I readied myself to find him in a worse condition. My imagination, however, could not prepare me for what I found. He was melting. The tight yellow skin on his face had flaked off like reptilian scales and revealed a soft pink undercover. He was still in deep delirium, and he still begged for more ice. Yet, between his fevered demands for ice, old John had another message. "My work, on top of my shelf by the door, My work, my life's work. Save it. Publish it. Make sure the knowledge does not die with me. I, once again, insist that I call an ambulance. He, once again, denied any medical assistance. With my next tour starting in but 15 short minutes, I relented to the old scientist's demands. His visage, however, did not leave my mind's eye. Just after I started the tour, I excused myself from the crowd and placed a quick call to Prague's emergency services. I told them of John and his medical dilemma. The voice on the other end of the line, much like most of the governmental representation in Prague, was far from friendly. They did, however, after much begging from my side, promise to visit John and call me back with an update. The update came almost an hour after my initial call. I was given an angry tongue lashing by the voice on the other side of the phone for making a prank phone call. Apparently, they found no old scientist in the basement of the ice pub. Apparently, misuse of emergency line was a crime, and I was lucky I was not being prosecuted. I did not argue with the voice on the line. They did not seem open to discussion, and, more importantly, had a crowd of 40 tourists waiting for me to talk about the 14th century. Instead, I quickened the pace of my tour and rushed back to the ice pub the moment it finished. The old scientist was, indeed, gone. All that remained of him was a foul-smelling puddle and his clothes. The idea that the old man had melted out of existence disturbed me greatly. Yet that biological mystery was quickly replaced by another. As instructed, I retrieved the old scientist's papers from the top shelf. I made an effort to read through them, but the handwriting and jargon were far too foreign for me to comprehend. The research in which the old scientist partook was confusing, but what truly broke me, what sent me to the brink of madness and forced me to burn all the papers which the frail man had left behind, was the stack of identification papers. Much of the documentation was ancient and written in German, yet inside of the pile I found a photograph ID from the turn of the century. It was a passport issued by the First Czechoslovak Republic, not 2 years after the end of World War I. Although over 100 years old, the photograph was undeniably of the old scientist who I had spent so many nights with. Born in 1882 into an empire that no longer existed, he looked no older or younger than when I had met him. His name, as the papers claimed, was Otakar Zima. Good evening, and welcome to the Cabinet of Fever Dreams. Tonight, a tale of Scotland, saxophones, and dread. I Heard the Saxophone of Erich Zann is read to you tonight by me, Mike J. Langer, with musical backing by The Dark Side of Music. If you want to help the spooky channel get the best busking spots on the streets of YouTube, please comment Saxophone and hit that like button. Also, if you'd like to hear these stories early and help keep the melody going, drop by patreon.com/MikeJLanger. All your support is greatly appreciated. With all that said, take a deep breath and check your notes. The music of Erich Zann is not an easy composition. Excuse me if I lack social grace. The past few years of my life have been spent in seclusion. My body repulses at the idea of telling this story, but I'm afraid that after tonight, my mind may be too far gone to repeat it. I want to commit this story to paper, so that people may know how I heard the music of Erich Zann. The first thing that greeted me at the hallway of the student halls was a beheaded fish.
It rested on a wooden cutting board with a butcher knife covered in a mess of guts next to it. After I took a couple steps into the hallway, I was greeted by the head of the fish. A shirtless ginger held it in his hands as a crowd of people gathered around him. They were all screaming, some of them trying to start chants, some of them simply shouting the word, lad. As the crowd produced phones to etch this moment into eternity, the ginger lifted the fish head into the air, took a deep breath, and swallowed it. The drunken crowd went wild. Some clapped, some dry-heaved, some simply screamed. These people would be my roommates for the next year. I had moved to Scotland for my studies. The universities back home were small, the job markets were limited, and I figured getting a start in an English-speaking country could open up more of the world to me. I thought that moving would be the first step towards adulthood. Instead, I got the student halls. The building I was moved into was a work in progress. The halls had 3 floors, but only the bottom floor was suited for student accommodation. The other 2 floors were strictly off limits to us. The closest people ever got to them was sneaking cigarettes in the emergency escape stairwell. Life was contained to the different dorm rooms and a communal kitchen in the center of the halls. I was assigned a room closest to the kitchen. The life in the halls was chaos. I tried fitting in. After the initial shock of my arrival, I stuck around for a couple of drinks. I tried some drugs. I went out to the sweat-stench clubs where everyone would spend their evenings. Yet the binges made me vomit. The pot put me in a self-aware panic, and the one time I pulled, it took me a dozen showers to wash off the shame of my one-night stand. During one outing, I even stole a traffic cone with some of the other freshmen. My trophy was proudly displayed in the kitchen, but after everyone had gone to sleep, I returned the cone back to where it belonged. It seemed cruel to let people stumble into the pothole on the street. The cone was there for a reason. Everyone around me was engaged in wanton self-destruction, but seemed to be doing just fine. They would snort horse tranquilizer in the evening, barely be able to talk during the night, but would be functioning students come afternoon. Meanwhile, I would stay sober and struggle to get out of bed any hour of the day. The one habit I did pick up in the halls was smoking. Along with a handful of other smokers, I would sneak out to the fire escape stairwell for the occasional cigarette. The staircase had become the smoking room of the halls. Someone had draped the condom over the smoke detector and set up a small jar to serve as the ashtray. Within a week or two, the jar was overflowing with stubs. After a month, the jar disappeared completely. In its place was a mountain of cigarette butts that everyone just added to. A small gust of wind could feed a poorly put out cigarette and set the whole mound on fire. It was in the smoking room that I would manage to have actual conversations. One-on-one, people strayed away from the caricature of drunken freshers culture. They had opinions, they had stories. I even managed to find a handful of people who wanted to check out a jazz concert at a cafe across the street. Yet as soon as we started to make plans, as soon as other people started getting involved, the group would morph into a crowd. The crowd had a mind of its own. The crowd wanted to go to places where the walls were wet with perspiration. The crowd did not like jazz. I woke up late October to a knock on my door. It was around 3:30. It wasn't the first time I was woken up in the night. About 30 minutes earlier, the kitchen got loud. 2 separate groups of clubgoers had collided while returning home. All the bars were closed, but they still wanted to drink. A meager supply of booze was fetched from their rooms. The rest of the building was searched for alcohol. I was already halfway conscious when someone was screaming about not being able to find anything worth drinking on the forbidden floors. By the time the knock on my door came, I was fully awake. It was the ginger. He had a nasty-looking black eye, but seemed no less cheery for it. He wanted to know if I had any liquor. I didn't. He went on to the next door. The ginger made his rounds and managed to obtain some leftovers from some of the other people in the halls. The newly awakened joined the gathering in the kitchen. The alcohol ran out again. The ginger made a scene of being irritated about the lack of booze. He ran through the halls screaming about how he just wanted one more drink. He finished off his rant by smashing his head through one of the flimsy dorm doors. The door he chose to break through was mine. His drunken face was embedded in the door. He looked at me in frozen terror, as if he was just planted into the situation out of nowhere, as if he had woken up with his head smashed into the strangest of places. Then he started to laugh. He kept on trying to put on his best Nicholson impression and say, "Here's Johnny," but the laughter kept on breaking his act. He was almost able to do the whole thing without giggling, but then he paused. He turned his attention inwards, took a deep breath, and vomited on my floor. Then he left. I had a hole in my door and puke on my floor. A couple of people popped by my new window and mumbled half-hearted apologies. Then someone fished out a guitar, and the whole crowd engaged in an intoxicated rendition of Wonderwall. I didn't know what to do. The thought of leaving the country and moving back home was nothing new. The first week in the halls set up the need to escape, and the rest of the stages provided more justification. I could move back home, go to a local university, be back around my high school friends, perhaps reconnect with my high school sweetheart. I kept on trying to assess whether life in Scotland could be salvaged. I didn't want to leave. Withdrawing felt like a failure, like I was tested by some foreign force and found wanting. The thought of retreat often kept me up at night as I balanced my options. On the night when my door was smashed, however, there was no options. I just wanted out. I just wanted to sleep. I don't remember exactly what I said. The anger strung me along without my input. I yelled about the vomit, about the broken door, about how they were keeping everyone in the flat up. It was with the last point that I realized the extent of the gathering. Everyone in the halls was present. I was the odd one out. The crowd jeered at me. Everyone had something to say. But since everyone was talking at the same time, I couldn't make out a word. I listened to the undecipherable wave of hatred. I started to doubt myself. Maybe I was in the wrong here. Maybe I was being uptight. But wherever I stood, I just wanted out. I just wanted to sleep. Someone yelled something about the rooms upstairs being free. If I didn't want to be a part of the crowd, I could be on my own. The rest of the freshers nodded on and cheered. Not wanting to listen to another barrage of insults, I grabbed my blankets and went upstairs. I took the stairwell to the forbidden floor. When it became apparent that I am, indeed, leaving, the crowd went wild. A rendition of "Hey, Hey, Goodbye" was drunkenly sung as I made my way up the stairwell. I could still hear them singing when I reached the second floor, but as soon as I left the stairwell and closed the door behind me, there was complete silence. The entire floor was perfectly still. The second floor was a perfect copy of the one below. The only visible difference was that it was much cleaner. The walls weren't smudged. There was no vomit stains on the floor, no broken doors in sight. There also was a draft in the hallway. Rather strange on a calm night, but I paid it no mind. The still silence of the floor was the only important part. I stalked off to the room next to the kitchen out of habit. The door was unlocked. I rolled myself up in blankets and passed out. The next morning, I woke up on my own. For the first time since I entered the halls, I came out of my slumber without outside influence. There were no arguments in the hallway, no loud sex, no people smashing their heads through doors. I just woke up. I woke up in surprisingly good spirits. Nothing had really changed, but there was a calmness in the air. The thoughts of dropping out started to seem rash. My mind raced with possibilities. I could join university societies to meet like-minded people. I could check in again with the smokers who liked jazz. That cafe across the street seemed ripe for a visit. Things looked hopeful. I spent a good hour in bed, thinking about how I could whip up my life into better shape. How I could go out there and experience the world and do the things I like to do back home. Maybe there was a second-hand instrument place where I could pick up a saxophone. It had been a while since I had played, but the appetite to create music started to rise in me. I wanted to compose and read and talk and experience the world. The urge to go and do something got too strong for me to stay in bed. It was a beautiful day. I picked up a book from my old room and went to the cafe across the street. That day still sticks in my head. I walked around with a pioneering optimism, rallying myself to face life. Every hurdle seemed passable. Memories of the past didn't sting. I started to realize that maybe the whole Scotland experiment wasn't a total failure. I had just had a troublesome arrival and was placed in a community that wasn't to my liking. I could meet new people. I could try new things. I could be happy. In the evening, I moved the rest of my things to my new room and settled down with a couple of shows. Then I went to sleep. As I drifted off, I recalled being excited about the day to come, about setting up a life for myself in which I could be happy. That was the last time I felt sane. I woke up gasping for breath. After a couple seconds, I managed to compose myself. My breathing mellowed, but I still felt the tightness in my chest. Whatever optimism I had during the day was now gone. It was replaced with a feeling of dread. My thoughts were so scattered I couldn't focus on any specific thing. All I knew was all was ruined, and it was all my fault. That's when I noticed the music. The music was coming from the room above me. The sound was faint. Even in the silence, it was difficult to hold on to. Yet as soon as I heard the small succession of the strained notes, the melody started to grow. My mind drifted with the music. As it caught on to a string of notes, quieter melodies emerged. I dug my nails into my palms. I squirmed. The music clawed at my soul. It was a sort of fugue with recurring melodies at its surface, but beneath it all there was an inescapable dread. The notes whimpered as if they were pleading for their life, yet they were intercut with bursts of chaos, as if they knew that their plea wouldn't be answered. The piece sounded like total anarchy, yet had a sort of order about it. Music indescribable with words. It was divorced of any genre, of any culture. It was divorced of anything human. Yet as uncomfortable as it made me, it drew me in. As much as the music disturbed me, as much as it made my eyes bulge and muscles tense, there was something strangely alluring about it. Something graspable. Something forbidden. I laid in bed, trying to figure out what instrument could produce such harrowing tones. The more I focused, the louder the music got. I started to recognize a familiar sound in the chaos. An alto saxophone. Without thinking, I got up, put my winter coat on, and made my way towards the stairwell. Something deep within me was pulling me towards the unearthly melody. Something was demanding I get closer to the source. As I ascended the stairwell, the music grew louder. The louder it got, the more layers started to emerge. The melody transcended the instrument it was played on. It chipped away at something darker, a sort of cosmic truth. Whoever created this music was supremely talented. I needed to see them play. At the top of the stairwell, I encountered an orange traffic cone. Someone must have stashed it up there, fearing a building inspection of the dorms. I pushed it aside and entered the third floor. The third floor was barren. There was no carpeting, there was no kitchen, just a long row of doors. A small bit of light emanated from one of them. It was the room from which the music came. I made my way towards that door. The creaky floor sounded off beneath my feet as I made my way across the hall. The groans of the wood accompanied the music, as if all in existence was a part of the maddening tune. I stopped at the door and took a deep breath. I was standing in front of a stranger's door, wearing nothing but my underwear and a winter coat. I wanted to think of what I was going to say to the stranger, but before I knew it, my hand had knocked on the door. The music stopped. For a moment, everything was still, as if the person on the other side of the door was pretending they weren't home. Then the floorboards started to creak. The blinders of an unseen window were pulled shut, and the room went silent again. My common sense was telling me I should leave. The music was gone, and my head started to clear. I wanted to be back in bed, yet my hand knocked for a second time. A flurry of activity arose on the other side of the door.
The wooden floor creaked as someone ran around the room. Furniture was rattled, things were pushed around. I could hear him taking deep breaths. Then he opened the door. His eyes were manic. They leaped all across my body as if they were recognizing a human for the first time in his life. His face modulated between fear and joy, as if he didn't know which to choose. Before me stood a clearly unstable old man. I introduced myself to him and told him I had heard him play. He opened his mouth to respond, but froze. A strange squeak escaped out of his toothless gums. He grabbed me by the hand and led me to the room. I followed. He immediately made his way towards a small desk and started writing something out on a piece of paper. His room was barren, missing many of the usual pieces of furniture a student room would have. There was no wardrobe, bookshelf, or even a bed frame. The old man presumably slept on the old mattress on the floor. The mattress possessed a strange bump, as if something was hiding beneath it. The only furniture in the room was a rickety-looking desk and chair. The old man finished writing. He picked up the paper in his bony fingers, but as he moved towards me, he took pause. He studied me. A glint of pity showed in his eyes, as if whatever was written on that note would bring me great harm. The blinders on the window quivered from an unfelt gust of wind. He handed me the paper. Excuse me if I lack social grace. It has been many years since I have had a visitor. My name is Erich Zann. My voice is mute, but I can play an instrument. Would you like to hear a song? I nodded. That's why I came here, to hear him play. Zann excitedly reached beneath his mattress and produced his instrument. As I had guessed, it was an alto saxophone. The alto was in a horrible shape, however, covered in dents and scratches. There was no way it could produce any sort of a clear sound. The insanity of the situation started to dawn upon me. I wanted to get up and leave, but the old man seemed so excited. His eyes now sparkled with pure joy. Any hint of anxiety had been stifled. He looked at me for reassurance. I nodded. He picked up his sax, started tapping his foot, and mouthed a countdown. 3, 2, 1. The old man launched into a song. There was a joyous rage in it. Nothing like the music I had heard moments earlier, but fascinating nevertheless. Zann played with the mark of a prodigy. His ability on the saxophone was breathtaking. As fascinating as the music was, however, his movements took away the show. He had transformed from an old feeble man to a wild youth dancing across the room. His frail body bounced around off the walls as the piece got more energetic. He came alive through the music. His energy built until he reached a crescendo. Then he fell into his chair. I applauded. That was hands down the best performance I had ever witnessed. The old man was joyous. His toothless smile beamed. I complimented him once more, but told him that it was not this song I was after. His face froze. I, once again, thanked him for his performance, but asked him whether he could play the song he had played earlier. He propped himself up from the chair, took a few labored breaths, and then started to tap his foot. 3, 2, 1. The man launched into the same song he had just finished playing. The music was still enthralling, but he was exhausted from his previous performance. His fingers started to slip. He was fumbling notes. The previous running around the room was now replaced with a slow shuffle. Seeing the man clearly struggle, I interrupted him. I explained, once again, that I was very thankful for his initial performance, but that I wanted to hear the song he had previously played. He avoided looking in my eyes. His gaze kept on shifting over to the window. I repeated both my appreciation and request. He nodded his head. 3, 2, 1. It was the same damned song. I grabbed him. I explained myself once again. I wanted to hear the song that he played before. The man seemed terrified, but I had come far enough to hear what I wanted to hear. I figured I would jog his memory with the tune itself. I attempted to whistle out a couple of the notes. His eyes bulged at the sound of them. The blinders on the window shuddered. He slapped me. We both jumped back from shock. He held his hands as if it were some foreign appendage.
He looked up at me in horror and pressed his finger to his mouth. Shh. He kept making the sound as he ushered me out of the room. Shh. He slammed the door. I heard him sit down on his mattress. As I stood in the hall, I could hear him shushing something in the room. It was as if my whistling of the notes had been such a brazen insult that he had to calm the cosmos himself. The slap didn't hurt. Zann was far too frail to cause any pain, but it knocked some sense into me. I was standing in the middle of a locked-off area in my underwear and a winter coat. I just received a concert from a strange man who hides at the top of my student halls. None of this was normal. It was time to sleep. I woke up to an unpleasant surprise. A stern-looking university employee was lecturing me on how breaking house rules could jeopardize the future of my education. I was forced back down to the chaos of my old room. The building inspection had arrived early in the morning. They were greeted with stained carpets, broken glass, and smashed-up doors. The first student they had met had a face covered in Sharpie cocks. We did not pass inspection. The halls were, once again, reminded of the rules about student housing. Quiet time after 10 p.m., no drinking in the halls, and an absolute avoidance of the other floors. We were put on a probationary period. There would be a housing inspection coming to our halls every week. Everyone was livid. Somehow, it had become an accepted truth that I was responsible for the building inspection. The fact that there was a reminder email sent out the previous week about university employees coming to the halls was completely irrelevant. This was all somehow my revenge for the door that the ginger slipped into. Within half an hour of the building inspection, people started accidentally dropping cans and other garbage through the hole in my door. Apparently it looked just like a trash disposal. I wouldn't be getting a new door for at least a week. I spent the whole day in bed. The room reeked of freshly cleaned vomit. People kept on shouting in the halls. Trash kept on getting thrown into my room. Yet none of it mattered. The only thing that I could think about was the horrid melody I had heard the night before. I was paralyzed in my bed. My mind was filled with horrible realizations. As the music played in my head, I was consumed with images of home. If I returned, my parents would be disappointed. My friends would have moved on. I would be alone. In my heart of hearts, I knew that the person who I had cared so much for during my high school years was now with someone else. A stranger they had met in a bar. A stranger they had grown to love. A stranger that was better than me. Erich Zann's demented melody accompanied all of these thoughts, a soundtrack of the world moving on and leaving me in a shallow grave. In the evening, most of the halls went out to drink. The floor was still not quiet. Knowing that the halls were almost empty, the people who were left behind visited each other's room, then engaged in roaring acts of passion. The grunts and moans echoed through the halls, yet the music of Erich Zann persisted in my memory. The sounds of ecstasy became a backing chorus to the otherworldly melodies stuck in my head. What once sounded like cries of pleasure now sounded like wails of hopelessness. The tune bent the world. It forced the universe to justify its existence to the beat. Around midnight, the moans had died down. Snoring could be heard from one of the rooms. I had spent the whole day trying to conserve enough willpower to move. My reserves had finally gathered enough energy for me to go have a cigarette. I put my coat on and headed towards the stairwell. The stairwell was untouched. It seemed like the building inspection had somehow missed all of the fire code violations. The mountain of cigarette butts still lay where it was the night before. The condoms still covered the smoke detector. I lit up and looked outside of the window at the cafe across the street. I desperately tried to latch on to the memories of the day I had spent at that cafe. I searched my soul for some sort of trace of contentment, a sign that the state of things could be redeemed. Beneath my current state, there was something else. There was a reality that I lived when the world was fine. I almost tasted a sweet elixir of the past. But then, I heard the music again. The memory of Zann's melody paled in comparison to his harrowing performance. His song reverberated through the stairwell. As soon as those first notes sent a chill down my spine, I knew I had no choice. I threw my half-smoked cigarette on the pile and ran upstairs. My movements were not my own. I was present,
but it felt as if I had passed on the controls of my body to some other force. I sprinted up the stairs with no attention for my safety. Even though my body shuddered with dread, the closer I got to the source of the music, I craved to near it. I needed to hear more. When I reached the 3rd floor, the safety cone was back where it was the night before. I threw it aside, not paying any mind to how it had traveled back to the door. I moved swiftly, but as soon as I reached the wooden floors, my movement slowed. I found myself crouched, each step calculated by a force outside of me as to not produce any creaks. I snuck my way towards Zann's door as the music grew. The music had always sounded bizarre, but the closer I got, the more convinced I was that it came from outside of the human realm. Zann played alone. His alto was the most prominent within the composition, but there were other instruments hidden within. Strings, percussion, even the hint of a moaning voice could be heard, but only if one focused. When other thoughts entered my mind, such as the insanity of the entire event, the other instruments died down. Yet my focus would always be restored. Zann's demented melody would not allow for other thoughts to coexist. I wanted to press my ear against the door. I wanted to be fully consumed by the dark song that he played, but instead, the door opened. A gentle gust of wind had slowly unlocked the door and spread it open without alerting Zann. I could finally see the master at play. The man was clearly in pain. All the gusto and energy of the previous performances were gone. Instead of jumping around the room, Zann was curled up with a saxophone on the floor. It was as if he was lost at sea and his instrument was the only thing keeping him afloat, as if his music was a cry to be rescued from certain death. He faced the window, as if he was playing to it. The blinders had been lifted, and one could see outside. Except what was outside of Zann's window wasn't the quiet skyline of the city. It was pitch darkness. Beyond the glass lay the abyss, and within that abyss, something called to me. I took another step forward. The floor creaked. Zann didn't even turn around to see where the noise had come from. As soon as the creak sounded off, he launched at the blinders and pulled them down. Keeping whatever was beyond those blinders secret was more important than his self-preservation. He held them still as they quivered, and only once he was sure that whatever was beyond the window was safely concealed, he turned around. His eyes searched me once again. His face went for a flurry of different emotions until it finally settled. He smiled his toothless smile. A sort of relief seemed to have passed through his body, as if being in my company had made whatever terror he was facing outside subside. He grabbed me by the hand and led me into his room. As soon as I was inside, he wrote a quick note on his desk. As he handed me the paper, he let out something akin to a laugh. His eyes were wet. He was on the verge of tears. "Excuse me if I lack social grace. My better years are past me and I am not used to others. You have come here for an explanation of the music, and I apologize for withholding that previously. Please, give me some time to explain myself." I nodded. Zann sat down at his desk and started to diligently write out his story. As he wrote, he would occasionally stop and stare at the page, as if he himself could not believe what he had written. After a moment of shock, he would start to laugh. It was not a laughter of humor, rather an imitation of laughter, something forced, something to coat what was on the paper with a hue of absurdity which he did not see. During these painful bursts of fox amusement, Zann would look over at me for reassurance, as if he wanted me to laugh with him. I would give him a polite chuckle, and he would continue writing. He had about 5 pages of his story written when he paused again. This time, however, he did not look at the page. He stared at the window. It was imperceptible at first, but as soon as he drew my attention, I could hear it too. A low tone came from the outside. The blinders started to vibrate. Zann quickly went back to writing. Now his careful lettering was gone. The man started to furiously scribble, trying to get out as many words as possible. His breath quickened. He started to whimper. The tone from the window grew. It strengthened in volume and grew in pitch. With every second that the tone advanced, Zann started to write more and more erratically. The tone had reached an unbearable tenacity. What was once a whisper in the silence was now an unearthly roar. The blinders bounced up and down on the window, trying to contain whatever force hid behind it. Zann wrote his last words and leaped to his feet. He pressed the stack of papers into my hand and started to usher me out of the room. He wanted me out. Whatever mad writings I had in my hands were to get as far away as possible. That is when the window burst. It all happened quickly. The tone had reached an unbearable frequency. The glass of the window cracked and exploded beneath its pressure. Suddenly a blast of wind rose from the window and circled around the room. It started to pull towards the outside. The blinders were ripped away to the darkness beyond. The whole room bent towards the window. I tried holding on to the papers, but before I knew it, they were out of my hands. They flew out of the window and immediately disappeared into the darkness. Whatever was beyond the window was angry. The tone had grown from a high-pitched squeal to a low growl. I wanted to run, but instead my body pulled me closer to the window. The abyss beyond beckoned. Zann tried to hold me back, but my arm knocked the frail man down. I could hear his whimpers for a few moments, but the growl from the abyss soon overpowered any notion of sound. I tried grabbing onto the table so that I could stop, so that I could turn around and go back to the safety of my own room, but my body refused to cooperate. I reached the window and wrapped my hands around outside. I was pulled out into the nothingness. The growl suddenly disappeared. As I leaned outside of the window, a still silence took hold. The abyss motioned towards me. My fingers squirmed on the windowsill. I tried to look away, but there was something there that demanded my attention. I was being invited in. I was being ordered in. I jumped. When my consciousness returned, my body was immediately seized with a flurry of pain. I'd landed in a bush, breaking most of my fall. My jacket had shielded me from most of the harm, but it was destroyed in the process. I tangled myself out of it, escaping with a couple of scrapes. I watched the fire. By all accounts, it had started in an emergency stairwell. The smoke detector somehow malfunctioned, and by the time the fire was noticed, it was far too late to save anything from the building. By sunrise, the halls were gone. None of the students were injured, but all of our possessions had turned to ash. The idea of asking about Zann seemed insane. I vowed to keep the events of that night to myself, and until tonight, I have. I left Scotland shortly after the fire. The university provided us with new halls, and the building I got assigned to was significantly calmer, but I wanted to get as far away from the source of music as I could. I moved back home and tried to carry on with my life. The surfings, things have been normal since then. I stumbled through my 20s in an unremarkable fashion. I would go to work, I would get paid, I would come back home. I've had friends, an odd relationship, but they never would stay for long. People would filter in and out of my life, but the memory of Zann's music stayed constant. When I first arrived back home, I felt aimless. I would spend days lying in bed, wondering what I was meant to do with my life. In a bout of mania, I fished out my old saxophone and played it. I figured that perhaps playing some music could make me feel better. When I played, my mood had not improved. Whatever took control of me that dreadful night had returned. As soon as I got out a couple of notes, Zann's melody returned to me. That horrible tune started to burrow its way into my head once more. I've been practicing. For years, I practiced every waking moment that I could afford. I have lived frugally and settled into the life of a hermit. It has taken me years, but bit by bit, I was able to rediscover fragments of Zann's music. Whenever I would play a series of those demented notes, the room would grow cold. The blinds in my window would quiver. I had never been able to play the whole song. Sections would emerge in my mind, but I lacked the practice to perform the full piece. I have never been able to play the whole song until tonight. I do not know whether I will come from this performance with my mind intact. Every fiber of my being is telling me to let the Zann business go, and there is nothing more that I would like to do than to wake up and be freed of the music's grasp. But I have no choice. The melody demands to be heard. What I do now, I do not do of my own free will. May this document serve as evidence of that.
I bid you good night. May you turn away when you are faced with temptation. 3, 2, 1.